Ray Guthrie had been sleeping on a cot in his brother's spare bedroom for 4 months when he found the listing. Not a bedroom, really. More of a storage room that Denny had cleared out for him after the divorce, after the VA cut his supplemental benefits, after Sandra packed the Hyundai and drove the kids to her mother's house in Beckley without leaving a forwarding number. The room held a folding cot, a lamp shaped like a bass fish that had been Denny's since college, and 3 cardboard boxes stacked against the wall containing everything Ray had brought with him from the house on Millbrook Drive. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. He was 46 years old. His right hand did not close all the way anymore. It hadn't since Fallujah in 2004, when the pressure wave from a buried IE rolled through the Humvee and scrambled something in the nerves below his elbow. The doctors at Walter Reed had a technical name for it. They always had a technical name. What it meant practically was that his grip strength tested at 12 pounds when a man his age should have been pulling 45, and that on cold mornings the fingers of his right hand curled inward like a fist someone else was making, without his permission, and stayed that way until he ran them under hot water long enough to argue them back open. He'd been working nights at Harmon Logistics since February. Security position. Mostly walking the perimeter of a warehouse that stored agricultural equipment, checking doors that nobody was ever going to break into in a county where everyone knew everyone, and crimes of opportunity ran more toward gas theft and unlocked trucks than commercial burglary. The job paid $14.20 an hour. He worked 5 shifts a week when his hand cooperated, for when it didn't, and the difference between 5 shifts and 4 was the difference between covering the $160 he sent Sandra every month for Nora and covering it plus eating something other than eggs and peanut butter. Nora was 16. She came to stay with him at Denny's for 2 weeks each summer, sleeping on a borrowed air mattress in the same base fish room because there was nowhere else. And during those 2 weeks, she did not once complain about the mattress or the room or the fact that her father's residence amounted to a cot and a lamp in his younger brother's house. What she did instead was bring her history books and her yellow highlighters and spend her mornings reading things she'd underlined and want to talk about at dinner, and her evenings asking Ray questions about his time in the service that she'd been building up to all year. She had her mother's face and Ray's stubbornness and a way of sitting very still when she was thinking about something serious that used to belong exclusively to Ray's father, dead now 17 years, who had sat exactly the same way in the porch chair at the house on Cedar Run before he answered any question worth answering. Ray loved his daughter with the particular ferocity of a man who understood how much he had already cost her. The listing appeared in the county property auction database at 11:43 on a Tuesday night in March. Ray was not looking for property. He was eating leftover chili at the kitchen table, half watching a YouTube video about transmission repair on his phone because Denny's truck had been making a grinding sound and neither of them had $300 to bring it to a mechanic. He switched to the county website by accident, looking for something else, and the listing loaded inside a grid of tax-delinquent properties the county needed off its books before the new fiscal year. Most of them were the usual inventory. Undersized residential lots in neighborhoods where the tax value exceeded what anyone would pay. A commercial parcel off Route 60 with drainage problems. 3 storage units in Quincy that had been foreclosed on after the owner died without a will. And then this, Lot 17, Harker Ridge Road. 3.2 acres. Unincorporated Latham County. Condemned structure on property. County demolition pending. Minimum bid $100. He looked at the photographs for a long time. The images showed a concrete block building, maybe 30 by 40 feet. The roof partially collapsed, the walls spray-painted in layers that went back far enough that the earliest ones had faded to gray. Weeds had claimed the perimeter and come halfway up the walls. A chain-link fence surrounded the structure, but sections of it had fallen inward, rendering it useless. Behind the building, in one of the aerial images, you could see what looked like a concrete pad overgrown with grass, and at the edge of that pad, something rectangular and metal, half submerged in the ground, that the photo quality was not good enough to identify clearly. The county records showed the parcel had last been owned by the federal government, transferred to county ownership in 1989 through a process listed as administrative abandonment. No prior residential use. Zoned agricultural, but too rocky and steep for farming. The condemned structure had been flagged for demolition 2 years ago. The The paperwork kept stalling. The county simply wanted someone to take the liability off its hands. 3.2 acres for $100. Ray Guthrie had not owned anything in 4 months. He bid at midnight, before he could talk himself out of it. He set the maximum at $150, which was what he had in the account he kept separate from the joint account Sandra still had access to. And he went to bed on the cot under the basefish lamp and lay there until 2 in the morning before he finally slept. Nobody outbid him. He found out 3 days later when the county sent a confirmation email, and he sat in the basefish room reading the words on his phone. Property auction confirmed. Lot 17, Harker Ridge Road. Winning bid, $100. He owned land. He called Nora that evening. She answered on the second ring, which was how he knew she'd been waiting for him to call. A habit she developed the same way he developed it, both of them always slightly on standby for the other. He told her about the lot, about the condemned building and the 3.2 acres and the $100. He described the aerial photograph with the concrete pad and the metal shape half buried at the edge. He told her he didn't know exactly what he was going to do with it yet. She was quiet for a moment in the way she got quiet when she was already thinking several moves ahead. Then she said, "Can I come see it?" He said yes. "Of course." She said, "Dad, something on a federal parcel that got abandoned in '89. Do you know what that was?" He said he didn't know yet. She said, "I'm going to find out." He believed her completely. The drive from Denny's house to Harker Ridge Road took 40 minutes on a cold Saturday morning, the last one in March, frost still on the fields in the low spots where the sun hadn't reached. Ray drove Denny's truck. Nora sat in the passenger seat with a yellow legal pad on her knee and a pen behind her ear. Taking notes, she hadn't started yet, leaving room for whatever the land would tell her. She'd been researching since the phone call. He could see it in the way she held herself, coiled slightly, the way she got before she told him something she'd worked hard to learn. He didn't push her. She'd tell him in her own order. They turned off the paved road onto Harker Ridge at a rusted mailbox post with no box on it anymore, just the post standing out of habit. The gravel road climbed for a quarter-mile through second-growth timber, ash and poplar mostly, and opened at the top onto a flat where the concrete block building stood in the gray March light exactly as it had looked in the photographs, except that photographs don't carry smell, and the smell when Ray opened the truck door was wet concrete and old metal and something underneath both of those, something mineral and cold, like the inside of a well. He stood in the frost-stiff weeds for a moment, right hand in his jacket pocket where he kept it on cold mornings, and looked at what he owned. The building was worse close up. The northeast corner of the roof had fallen in completely, and what was left of the roofline sagged in a curve that meant the rest of it was coming down whenever the next significant snow or ice storm decided things. The spray paint went back in layers you could distinguish by studying the edges. The newest was a tag in red from someone who'd bent the chain link to get in. Beneath it, in black, something older, faded enough that the letters were more suggestion than definition. Beneath that, going back to at least the 1990s based on the style, 3 more layers of marks that meant nothing to Ray but would have meant something to whoever made them. The windows had been covered with plywood at some point, screwed in with serious hardware, not the kind of covering you put up temporarily. Someone had wanted this building closed. Several of the plywood sheets had been pried partway off since then. Not all the way, just enough to look in. Whatever was inside hadn't been worth the effort of taking. Nora walked the perimeter without speaking, legal pad tucked under her arm, taking photographs on her phone, stopping every few feet to examine something up close. She had her hair in a braid today, practical for fieldwork, she'd told him when he asked. She wore the green canvas jacket she'd bought at the Army surplus store in Beckley last summer, 2 sizes too large, the sleeves rolled up twice. She stopped at the concrete pad behind the building. The pad was about 60 by 60 feet, Ray estimated. Poured concrete, 8 inches thick based on what he could see where a corner had cracked and lifted. Old growth lichen covered most of the surface in overlapping gray-green circles. At the center, almost invisible under the lichen and the leaf debris that had accumulated over decades, was a seam in the concrete. A rectangle, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, with what appeared to be a recessed handle of some kind, black with corrosion, flush with the surface. Ray crouched to look at it. His right knee ached in the cold, a different injury, a different story, something that happened getting off a helicopter in 2003 that he had not filed a claim for, Because in 2003 there were men getting off helicopters who never walked again, and a bad knee felt ungrateful to mention. What is that? He said. Nora crouched beside him. Hatch. Her voice was careful, already building toward something. Below-grade access. She looked at the building, then back at the concrete pad, then at the tree line. Dad, I need to tell you what I found. Tell me. This parcel. Lot 17 on Harker Ridge. She pulled out the legal pad, which was already covered in her small, tight handwriting. Prior to 1989, it was registered under a farce. Army Facilities Acquisition and Retention System. Not county land. Not state land. Army land. He looked at her. It was part of a REMBASS relay network. She flipped to a page with notes and a diagram she'd drawn from something she'd found online. Remote Battlefield Sensor System. Cold War era. The Army installed relay stations across the Appalachian Ridge system in the 1960s and 70s. They were supposed to be redundant communications infrastructure for if the main networks went down. Most of them were small. Above-ground equipment shed and below-ground relay hardware. She tapped the legal pad. The county records say the building was decommissioned in '89, but the land transfer documents say administrative abandonment, not standard closure. Those are different procedures. How different? Ray said. Standard closure means they came in, stripped the equipment, sealed everything, documented it, signed off. Administrative abandonment means they stopped paying taxes and let the county take it over. She looked at the hatch. Whatever is down there, Dad. She paused. They might not have closed it. Denny's reaction that evening was immediate and delivered from across the kitchen table while he was eating the leftover chili Ray had reheated and presented as payment for the use of the truck. You bought a condemned lot in the middle of nowhere for $100, and there might be a hole in the ground under it that the Army forgot to close, he said. That's correct. You're a disabled veteran living in my base fish room who makes $14.20 an hour, and you spent your last $150 on this. I bid $150. They took $100. Denny chewed. He was 3 years younger than Ray and worked for the utility company and had a house that contained a base fish room and a wife named Paulette who was at her sister's that weekend and would have had a lot to say about this conversation if she'd been present. "You're going to call the VA about it," Denny said. "The VA is not going to help me investigate a Cold War relay station. You're going to call someone." Ray was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "I'm going to go back tomorrow. Start clearing brush. Get a better look at that hatch." Denny stabbed another piece of chili meat with his fork. "The Army forgot to close a door on a piece of land, and you spent your last money to buy the land." He shook his head. "I cannot tell if this is the most Ray Guthrie thing you've ever done or the craziest. Maybe both." Denny pointed his fork. "You break your other hand falling into an Army hole. Don't come crying to me." Ray said he wouldn't. The mocking did not wait for an invitation. It arrived the next week in the form of Dale Pruitt, who worked at the county assessor's office and heard about the sale through county property records the way Dale Pruitt heard about everything in Latham County, through the simple fact of working in the office where everything got recorded and having no natural reluctance to discuss what he read. Dale lived 4 houses down from Denny's place and found excuses to stop by for reasons that Ray had never fully analyzed but suspected had to do with having an audience for opinions that his wife Lorraine had stopped listening to years ago. He appeared on Denny's porch on a Wednesday, hands in his jacket pockets, with the look of a man delivering news he'd been saving. "Heard you bought lot 17 on Harker Ridge," Dale said. "That's right. $100. 100. Dale shook his head with the slow thoroughness of someone conducting a professional assessment. "My office processes those condemned properties every quarter. That parcel's been circling for 2 years. We had it listed at $50. Nobody bid. Raised it to $100. Nobody bid. You know why nobody bid? Because they didn't see what I see." Dale looked at him. "Because it's 3.2 acres of clay and rock with a building on it that the county has to pay to knock down, and a hole in the ground the county's going to have to fill before they can sell it to someone with the sense not to buy a hole in the ground." Ray was quiet. "It's a liability," Dale said. "Whoever owns it owns the liability for the structure, which is condemned, and for whatever the hole contains, which neither you nor the county actually knows. If there's contamination down there, military chemicals from 40 years ago, you could own a Superfund site." Dale said this with a particular satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man who had worked in assessments and had been waiting his whole adult life for a situation where this specific knowledge had social value. You understand what Superfund means in terms of personal liability? I understand. You've got a condemned building you can't afford to demolish, a hole you can't afford to investigate, and 3.2 acres of land that won't grow anything because it's 40% rock. He paused. For $100. Ray looked at Dale Pruitt the same way he'd learned to look at men who talked loudly in the minutes before something important happened. Level. Patient. Giving nothing back. Thank you for stopping by, he said. Dale left with the air of a man whose warning had been ignored by someone too stubborn to know better. Ray went inside and sat at Denny's kitchen table with the county parcel records and Nora's notes from her research and looked at all of it for an hour without speaking. Denny came through at some point and opened the refrigerator and looked in it and closed it again. Dale been over, he said. Ray said yes. Denny opened the refrigerator again. He told you about Superfund. He did. Denny closed the refrigerator. Is he wrong? Ray looked at the parcel records. He's not entirely wrong. He's also not asking the right questions. What are the right questions? Ray tapped the county transfer document, specifically the section describing the 1989 administrative abandonment. The Army doesn't walk away from a site without a reason. They abandon it because the cost of proper closure exceeds the perceived value of the asset, or because something changed in their classification of the site that made closure more complicated than abandonment. He looked up. Administrative abandonment means paperwork got complicated. Complicated paperwork usually means there's something worth being complicated about. Denny opened the refrigerator a third time and took out a beer. You've been reading too much of Nora's research, he said. Ray said, she comes by it honest. The people Ray had known in the service were mostly scattered now, the way veterans scatter after the structure that held them in proximity is removed. But there were a few he still had numbers for. Men he'd served with or alongside who'd gone in different directions after discharge and ended up in occupations that sometimes made them useful in ways they hadn't expected. Carter Webb had been a sergeant first class in military intelligence out of Fort Meade, separated in 2011 after 15 years, and gone to work for a security consulting firm in Arlington. He was not someone Ray called often, not because they'd lost the connection, but because Carter was busy in ways that made the call feel like an imposition unless the reason was worth it. Ray called him on a Thursday evening from the parking lot of the Harmon Logistics warehouse, 40 minutes before his shift started. He explained the parcel. The administrative abandonment in 1989. The REMBASS relay designation in the Army facilities records. The hatch in the concrete pad that did not look decommissioned. He explained it the way you learned to brief things in the Army, leading with the most critical information. Carter was quiet for a moment after. Harker Ridge Road, he said. Latham County. That's right. He was quiet again. Then, I'm going to make some calls. Don't dig anything out of that hatch until I get back to you. Ray said he wouldn't. Carter called back 2 days later. The parcel had come up in a records request Carter ran through a colleague who still had access to Army facilities documentation. The REMBASS relay station on Harker Ridge had been listed for formal decommissioning in fiscal year 1990. The decommissioning had been scheduled, assigned a project number, and then suspended when the project was transferred to a different contracting command. The suspension was supposed to be temporary. The project number sat in an inactive file for 3 years until the contracting command was itself reorganized in the early 90s and the file transferred again. By the time anyone looked at it, the county had already taken ownership and the Army's internal position had shifted to there's nothing of value remaining on site. But that was an assumption, Carter said, not a verified closure. Nobody went back in. Nobody went back in, Ray said. There was a pause. Carter said, I'm going to send you something. Don't share it. It's not classified anymore. It's been declassified since 2012 as part of a broad release. But I'm sending it as a friend, not through official channels, because going through official channels about a site you now own would complicate things faster than you'd want. What am I going to find when I read it? Ray said. Carter said, what was in those relay stations wasn't just communication hardware. Cold War redundancy planning meant some of those sites were designated as secondary resource depositories. Precious metals primarily. The Army stored physical assets in geographically distributed locations as a hedge against centralized system failure. Silver mostly. Monetary reserves in tangible form. Ray sat in the parking lot of the Harmon Logistics warehouse for a long moment. You're saying there might be silver in that hatch, Carter said. I'm saying the documentation from that period suggests the station on Harker Ridge was one of 17 sites in the Appalachian Relay Network designated as a Class 3 resource depository. Class 3 meant a physical asset component. Whether it's still there, whether it was removed during the period when they thought they were going to properly decommission it, whether the administrative abandonment happened before or after any retrieval. He paused. I don't know. How much silver? Ray said. Carter was quiet for a moment. Class 3 in the documentation I'm looking at. The amounts listed are denominated in troy ounces. The listed quantity for this specific station. He paused again, and Ray could hear him reading something. 6,400 troy ounces. Ray sat very still. He did the math in his head, the way you do math when the numbers are so far outside your daily frame of reference that precision feels unnecessary. Silver was trading around $26 a troy ounce. He'd seen it recently. 6,400 troy ounces at $26 was somewhere north of $160,000. For a man who had spent 4 months on a cot in his brother's base fish room, $160,000 was not a number that fit inside his understanding of his own life. He said, Carter. Carter said, yeah. He said, you don't know if it's still there. Carter said, no, I don't. And the Army is going to have a complicated legal position on whether abandoned government assets on land transferred to county ownership and then sold to a private party constitute personal property of the purchaser or retained federal property. That's not my area. You'd need a lawyer who specializes in federal property law for that question. Ray said, okay. Carter said, I'd open that hatch carefully. Document everything. Don't remove anything until you understand the legal situation. And Ray, he paused. Don't tell people about this until you know what you have. Ray said he understood. He sat in the parking lot for another 10 minutes before he went inside to start his shift. He didn't sleep well in the days that followed. Not from worry exactly, but from the particular restlessness of a man standing at the edge of something that might change the shape of his life, unable to move toward it until the conditions were right. He called Nora the next morning. He didn't tell her about Carter's call. Not yet. He wanted her to be there when they opened the hatch, the way he tried to be there for things that mattered in her life. He simply told her he needed her help, that he wanted her to come up that weekend if Sandra would allow it, that there was more to investigate. She said, Dad, what did you find out? He said, come up and I'll show you. She said, that means you found something. He said, come up. She said, okay, but you're going to tell me everything the second I get there. He said he would. Sandra called that evening. Her voice had the particular flat quality it got when she'd been thinking about something long enough that the emotion had burned off, and what remained was just the practical reality she needed to address. She said, Nora told me she wants to come up again this weekend. Ray said yes. She said, Ray, you're living in Denny's storage room. I know. You bought land for $100 that has a condemned building on it. Nora told me. She's been researching it all week. She's very excited. She's allowed to be excited. I'm not saying she isn't. Sandra paused. I'm saying she gets this from you. This thing where you see something that looks like nothing and decide it's actually everything. She has it too. It's not always good. Ray thought about Fallujah. About the specific moment in 2004 when the thing that looked like nothing turned out to be something. And the difference between his outcome and someone else's had been the angle of the blast and 30 seconds of timing. He thought about how since then he had sometimes wondered whether his ability to look at something that appeared useless and decide it had value was a strength or a symptom. He said, sometimes it's nothing. Sometimes it isn't. Sandra was quiet. He said, she's 16. She's good at research. She's good at this kind of thing. Let her come up. After a pause, Sandra said, okay. Friday night. Have her back by Sunday evening. He said he would. After he hung up, he sat in Denny's kitchen for a while. Paulette was making something that smelled like garlic and tomatoes on the stove. Denny was watching television in the next room. Ray sat at the kitchen table with the county records and the photograph of the hatch and thought about what his life had looked like 2 years ago and 3 years before that, and so on back to when he was 23 years old boarding a plane from Fort Campbell to Kuwait and believing he understood what he was going toward. He had not understood. But then nobody did, going toward a thing. You only understood it coming back, and only sometimes then. Paulette set a plate down in front of him without being asked, pasta with the garlic sauce, a piece of bread on the side. She did this occasionally, not because she felt sorry for him, or at least not only that, but because she was a practical woman who believed feeding people was part of how you took care of them. She did not say anything. She went back to the stove. Ray ate and looked at the photograph of the hatch. Nora arrived Friday evening with her backpack and a canvas duffel and a library book about Cold War military infrastructure in the Appalachian region that she'd requested through interlibrary loan and received with what must have been alarming speed given that she'd put the request in on Monday. She dropped the bag and held up the book. Chapter 7, she said. REMBASS Relay Stations, 1962 to 1988. She sat down at Denny's kitchen table. Dad, these stations. Some of them had subsurface components that were never on the public record. The Army built them below grade specifically so they wouldn't appear in aerial surveys. She opened the book to a marked page. The above-ground building was just an access structure. Everything that actually mattered was underground. I know, Ray said. She looked at him. You know, I made some calls. She set the book down and looked at him the way she looked at people who had information she didn't yet have, patient but focused. Tell me everything. He told her. Not the specific numbers, not yet. He told her about the administrative abandonment, about the contracting command reorganization, about Class 3 resource depositories. He told her there was documented evidence suggesting the station might contain physical assets that were never retrieved. Nora listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Physical assets, she said. That's the language in the documentation. What kind? Silver. Carter said silver. In the original designation. Nora was quiet again. Her fingers rested still on the library book. This is real, she said. This isn't just an old concrete building. It might be nothing. The documents say what was designated, not what's actually there. They might have come and taken it before the administrative abandonment. We don't know, but they might not have. They might not have. She looked at the library book and then at the window and then at Ray. That's why the hatch matters, she said. That's why the hatch matters. She nodded once, the way she nodded when she'd decided something. Okay, tomorrow morning we go out there and open it. Ray said, it's not going to be that simple. We don't know what tools we need. The hatch might be sealed. It's been 30-some years. There could be structural issues below grade. Safety concerns. Nora said, Dad. Ray said, what? She said, I know you're being careful. And I know there's a lot we don't know. But there's a hatch in the ground on your land that the Army put there and never came back to deal with. And we need to look at what's behind it. He looked at his daughter for a moment. She had his stubbornness. Sandra was right about that. She also had something he wasn't sure he could name exactly. A particular quality of being present to what was in front of her without flinching, that he recognized as something his own father had possessed, and that he'd spent 20 years trying to locate reliably in himself. He said, tomorrow morning. She said, bring a good flashlight. The morning was clear and cold, the sky the specific pale blue of early spring in the mountains when the warmth hasn't fully committed yet. They took Denny's truck up Harker Ridge Road again, stopping at the flat where the building stood. Nora had her backpack and her legal pad and the library book. And Ray had his toolbox, which contained among other things a good flashlight, a pry bar, a can of WD-40 he'd bought the night before, and the heavy-duty gloves he wore on his right hand that let him exert pressure without the fingers unclenching at the wrong moment. They walked the property first. Ray had been back twice during the week to clear brush from around the building, and the work had made a difference. The worst of the thorn growth was cut back. You could see the foundation clearly now, solid poured concrete beneath the block walls. No sign of compromise at the base even if the walls above were damaged. The building itself was not salvageable as it stood, but the footprint it sat on was sound. He'd also cleared the area around the concrete pad, and in the clearer light of a morning without overcast, with the brush pulled back and the leaves swept, the hatch was more visible than it had been before. Nora crouched at the edge of it and studied the handle assembly. It was a flush-pull design, military specification, the kind made to sit level with the surrounding surface so nothing protruded that could be damaged by heavy equipment moving overhead. The black was corrosion on what was originally a protective coating, and under the corrosion the metal was still structurally sound when she tapped it with the pry bar Ray handed her. She worked the tip of the bar into the recess and applied pressure experimentally. Nothing moved. She applied more. Nothing moved. She said, it's not just corroded. There's a locking mechanism. Ray looked at the handle assembly more carefully. There was a keyway on the left side of the pole, barely visible under decades of debris. Military padlock or integrated lock cylinder. He pulled out the WD-40 and sprayed the keyway and the hinge points he could identify. and then they stood and looked at it for a moment. "This is going to need more than what we have," he said. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. Nora walked around the concrete pad slowly. She stopped at the far edge, near where the tree line began, and looked down at the ground. Ray came to stand beside her. There was a second seam in the concrete, much smaller than the hatch, maybe 12 inches square. No visible handle, but the same construction, the same intentional quality to the edges. Nora said, "Secondary access." Ray crouched. "Electrical conduit, maybe. Or a vent." She crouched beside him. "If the main hatch locks from above, what locks from below?" Ray looked at her. She said, "The facility was designed to function whether the people inside could get out or not. That's the doctrine for these stations. The people staffing a relay station in the event of actual conflict needed to be able to seal themselves in. So the primary hatch has an external lock to prevent unauthorized access during peacetime. But there has to be a way to open it from inside in the event of emergency." She opened the library book to a marked page. "It's in here. Every below-grade REMBASS station had an emergency egress protocol. Secondary access panel connects to a manual release for the primary hatch." Ray looked at the smaller panel. "It's just a concrete cap. No lock." She said, "Can you get the pry bar under it?" He could. It took 10 minutes of working the bar around the perimeter and applying force in short increments. His right hand braced, and his left doing the pulling. But the panel came up clean, concrete cap over a 12-inch steel sleeve that went down about 2 feet and terminated at a mechanical assembly. Inside the sleeve were 2 things: a coiled cable attached to a spring mechanism at the bottom, and above the spring mechanism, a length of braided steel cord with a ring at the end. Nora looked down into the sleeve for a long moment. She said, "That's the manual release." Ray looked at her. She said, "If I pull that ring, it disengages the locking mechanism on the primary hatch from below. You think?" She said, Chapter 7, page 163. She did not open the book. She'd already read it enough to say it from memory. Manual release cord, anodized ring, disengages tumblers on primary hatch lock from below in emergency egress situation. The ring had gone dark gray from oxidation. But it was a ring, at the end of a braided steel cord, inside a sleeve beneath the edge of the concrete pad on Ray Guthrie's 3.2 acres on Harker Ridge Road. Ray looked at the hatch. He looked at his daughter. He thought about Carter's voice on the phone 2 days ago, steady and careful, saying document everything and 6,400 troy ounces in the same call. He thought about 4 months on a cot in his brother's base fish room. About Nora on a borrowed air mattress for 2 weeks every summer, not complaining. About his right hand that didn't close all the way anymore, and the $14.20 an hour and the $150 he'd kept in a separate account and spent on a condemned lot because something in the photograph had told him it mattered. He said, "Okay." He lowered his left hand into the sleeve and found the ring and closed his fingers around it. He pulled. From across the concrete pad came a sound. Not loud. A series of mechanical clicks, clean and precise, like tumblers finding their positions in sequence, the sound of a mechanism doing exactly what it was designed to do after a very long time of not being asked to do anything. The hatch moved. Not swung open, not dramatically lifted. Just shifted, settling slightly upward in its frame. The locking tension released, the weight of the steel resting now against the concrete lip without the mechanism holding it shut. Nora walked to the hatch. She looked at Ray. He came and stood beside her, and they both looked at the gap that had appeared around the edge of the door, the thin line of dark where the hatch had lifted away from the frame. Cold air came through the gap. Not just the cold of underground earth, which was expected. Something else beneath it, the specific quality of sealed space, air that had not moved in a very long time. Ray pulled the flashlight from his toolbox and clicked it on. He worked his fingers under the lip of the hatch, his right hand and his left both pulling until the door swung upward and back and rested against the ground behind it, locked open on its own hinge. The beam went down. Steps. Steel rungs set into a concrete shaft, going down maybe 12 feet. At the bottom, a floor. And past the floor, visible even from above, the beginning of a corridor. Walls of poured concrete, intact. Ceiling low, maybe 6 feet. Dry. No water damage visible from up here. Dry and intact, and dark and waiting. Nora stood beside Ray at the edge of the open hatch, both of them looking down. She said, "Dad." He said, "Yeah." She said, "Nobody's been down there for 30 years. He said, "Looks like." She said, with the kind of care people use when they're about to say something they want to remember saying, "Whatever is down there belongs to you." Ray Guthrie stood on his 3.2 acres at the edge of a hatch the army had forgotten to close, with his daughter beside him and a flashlight in his hand, and everything that came next still unknown, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like he was in exactly the right place. They went down. Ray first, one hand on the steel rungs set into the shaft wall, testing each one before committing weight, flashlight tucked into his jacket pocket with the beam pointing ahead. The rungs held. Military construction, poured into the concrete during the original installation, not bolted on after the fact. You could feel the quality of them through the gloves. Built to last in the way the army built things it expected to actually need. Nora followed, her own phone flashlight on, the legal pad folded into her back pocket. She counted the rungs as she descended. 14. The shaft was about 12 feet deep. At the bottom the floor was concrete, poured flat, no pooling or cracking visible. The air carried the cold mineral smell that Ray had noticed from above, and underneath it something else he couldn't immediately name. Something like machine oil and old rubber insulation and paper, the smell of things that had been sealed away from air and moisture for decades and had not degraded but had simply been waiting. The corridor was 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, poured concrete throughout, and it ran straight for maybe 40 feet before meeting a T-intersection. The walls were dry, no water staining. The ceiling showed the marks of conduit channels where wiring had run, and the wiring was still there in some sections, copper still in place, not stripped. People who strip copper wire do it because they need money or they're being paid to salvage. Nobody had been in here doing either. Nora moved her phone flashlight slowly across the left wall of the corridor. There were painted markings. Military technical labeling in white paint, the kind you saw on army installations everywhere. Concise information in standard formats. Storage designations. Room numbers with letter prefixes. A fire suppression diagram with zones marked in red. She stopped at a metal frame mounted to the wall just inside the entrance. The kind of frame that holds a facility log or inspection sheet on any army installation. Inside the frame was a laminated sheet, water spotted at the lower corners, but readable in the center where the laminate had protected the paper. She leaned in close and read it aloud. Site designation, Yarn 7. Primary classification, C3RD, status, active standby pending formal closure. Last inspection, June 14, 1988. She read it twice. Then she looked at Ray. C3, she said. Class 3. This is the right station. Ray stood very still. She read the bottom line again. Pending formal closure. They left it on active standby. They were still calling it active the last time anyone looked at it. Active standby, Ray said. She said, that means in their records it was never transitioned to inactive, never formally decommissioned. They left the status as pending because they thought they were coming back. She looked at the corridor ahead. They never came back. Nobody came back. They moved to the T intersection and went right. A door on the left side of this corridor, steel frame. Heavy, the kind with a bar handle that you press down to engage the latch. Unlocked. It swung inward on hinges that protested but moved. The room beyond was maybe 20 by 30 feet. Equipment racks along 3 walls, the kind made from welded angle iron, painted gray. Half the racks were empty. The other half held equipment Ray could not immediately identify. Black cases with military specification labels, the kind of housing that covered electronics designed for hardened field use. Some of the cases had been opened, covers off, interiors visible. Most had not. On the floor, a wooden crate, broken open, empty. The stenciling on the side read ComSec and a serial number and a date from 1985. Next to it, a metal cabinet on wheels, locked, with a combination dial. Next to that, against the far wall, stacked in a way that suggested someone had moved them there intentionally, 16 ammunition cans. Olive drab. Military specification ammo cans, the kind with the rubber gasket seal on the lid. Sealed. Ray counted them from the doorway. 16 cans. He looked at Nora. She was looking at them too. He said, "Do not open those yet." She said, "I know." He said, "We don't know what's in them. Could be anything. We need to understand what we're looking at before we touch anything." She said, "I know, Dad." She kept looking at the cans. They were the right size for things other than ammunition. The right size, for example, for silver coins or silver bars if silver was what you were storing in hermetically sealed military containers designed to preserve contents across decades of storage in a sealed underground facility. She kept looking, but she did not touch them. They went back to the T intersection and went left. Another corridor, shorter, ending at a second door. This one was different, heavier than the first. The frame was welded steel plate, not the standard angle iron. The door itself was solid steel, maybe 2 inches thick, with a combination lock built into the door, not separate from it. Not an add-on padlock, but an integral part of the construction. The combination dial was protected by a steel plate bolted over the original housing with security screws, the kind that stripped on removal, meaning once you locked this cover down you could not get it back off without destroying it. Nora stood in front of this door for a long time. She said, "This is different." Ray said yes. She said, "The first room. The equipment, the ammo cans. That's accessible. Whoever designed this facility could have retrieved those if they'd come back." She was thinking out loud, building towards something. But this door. She touched the combination housing with one finger. They didn't want anyone getting into this room without authorization. Even people who had legitimate access to the rest of the facility. This is a vault door. Ray looked at it. He looked at the vault door, and he thought about 6,400 troy ounces, and about Carter's voice saying document everything, and about the fact that the last person to turn that combination dial had turned it sometime before June of 1988 and had walked out of here and climbed those 14 rungs back to the world above and had never returned. He said, "We're going to need help with this." Nora turned to look at him. Her flashlight backlit her face, and her expression was careful and serious, and exactly the expression his father had worn when he was about to say something that had taken him a long time to get ready to say. She said, "Dad, what did Carter actually tell you about this place?" He looked at her. She said, "The specific numbers." "What did he say?" Ray thought about it for a moment. Then he told her, 6,400 troy ounces. The listed designation, Class 3 Resource Depository. The silver the Army had distributed to geographically isolated relay stations as physical reserves during the period when they were genuinely planning for the possibility that centralized systems might fail, that a network of underground facilities might be the only thing functioning in the aftermath of something nobody wanted to happen, but that everyone who worked in this corridor and stations like it had spent their careers preparing for. Nora listened without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "At current prices." He said, "Over $160,000. If it's there. If they didn't retrieve it before the administrative abandonment. If it's actually what the documents say, and not just a designation they never filled." She said, "Okay." He said, "That's a lot of ifs." She said, "Every one of those ifs is answerable." She turned back to the vault door. "This answers most of them." She looked at the combination housing. "Whether there's silver on the other side of this door, that answers all of them." Ray looked at the vault door. He said, "We need a lawyer before we open that. Before we even try. If there is something in there, the legal question of who it belongs to matters more than the value. Government assets. Land transfer. Private property law." Carter said, "It's complicated." Nora said, "I know." She took a photograph of the vault door. She took photographs of the combination housing and the door frame and the room dimensions and the corridor behind them. She photographed the facility log at the entrance and the equipment racks in the first room and the 16 ammo cans stacked against the wall. Then she photographed Ray standing at the bottom of the shaft looking up at the circle of blue sky above them, which was the photograph she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. Her father in the underground facility that the Army had forgotten, on his $100 lot, looking up at the opening, with everything still ahead of him. They came up into the March air and sat at the edge of the concrete pad with the hatch resting open behind them and the mountain visible over the tree line to the east, still carrying snow on the north faces that didn't get enough sun to melt. Nora opened her legal pad to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "What we know." Beneath it she wrote what they knew. The site designation, the Class 3 classification, the last inspection date, the 16 ammo cans, the vault door. The fact that the facility log still said active standby in June of 1988 and nobody had changed it since. Beneath that she wrote, "What we need." She looked at Ray. He said, "A lawyer who specializes in federal property law, documentation of the Army's abandonment process, specifically the administrative abandonment protocol and what it means for assets left on site. Carter's records showing the Class 3 designation." He paused. "A vault specialist who can tell us what we're looking at with that combination mechanism. And we need to be able to prove the lot was legally transferred from federal ownership to county ownership, and then to me. Chain of title. Clean." Nora wrote all of this down. Then she looked at the hatch and back at the legal pad and said, "They're going to try to take it." "Who?" She said, "When people find out. When this becomes real. Someone is going to argue the Army still has a claim. Someone is going to argue government assets can't transfer through an administrative abandonment." She said it the way she said things she'd already thought through, not as speculation, but as a statement of probability she'd already accepted. "We need the law on our side before anyone else knows what's down there." Ray looked at his daughter. She was 16 years old. She had a legal pad and a library book, and she'd found the secondary access panel that opened the hatch, and she was already 3 steps ahead of the legal problem. Before he'd finished articulating it, he said, "How did I get you?" She said, "Good genes, and you paid child support on time." He laughed. Short and real, the kind that surprised him. She said, "We need to call a lawyer Monday morning." He said, "I know a name." Carter mentioned someone. "Federal property specialist in Charleston." She said, "Call them first thing." He said, "I will." She said, "And Dad?" He looked at her. She said, "Dale Pruitt. Denny's neighbor. The one from the assessor's office." Ray said, "What about him?" She said, "Don't tell him anything." He said, "I wasn't going to." She said, "I know. I just wanted to say it out loud." They sat at the edge of the concrete pad on Ray Guthrie's 3.2 acres on Harker Ridge Road, with the hatch open behind them and a vault door 40 feet underground waiting to show them what the Army had left behind, and the cold spring sun moved across the mountain the way it moves in early April when the light is changing its mind about the day. Ray's right hand lay in his lap, fingers partially curled the way they went when the temperature dropped. He looked at it for a moment the way he sometimes looked at it, clinically, the way you eventually learned to look at a thing that was part of you, but that operated on its own terms. Then he put it on Nora's shoulder, and she put her hand over his, and they sat there while the sun moved and the mountain kept its snow, and below them, in the sealed darkness, something waited that had been waiting for 35 years for someone to finally come back. If you want to see what was inside that vault door, and what happened when a lawyer named Margaret Holt ran a federal property search and found something in those records that nobody in Latham County was prepared for, subscribe now so Part 2 finds you. What comes next doesn't just change what this land is worth. It changes who has a claim to it, and why that question is going to put Ray Guthrie in a fight he never expected to have to win. The lawyer's name was Margaret Holt, and she had an office on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Charleston that smelled like old wood and coffee, and the particular kind of accumulated paper that comes from 20 years of working in federal property law. Ray drove down Monday morning, leaving before 6 to make the 8:30 appointment Carter Webb had arranged with a single text message Sunday night. The drive took 2 hours through mountains that showed green on the south-facing slopes and gray on the north, the season dividing itself along the ridgeline the way it did every March in West Virginia, winter and spring arguing about jurisdiction. He sat in the office across from Margaret Holt with the county parcel records and the photographs of the facility and Carter's documentation on his side of the desk and waited for her to finish reading. She read everything twice. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, gray hair cut short and practical, reading glasses on a chain around her neck that she wore while she read and took off when she talked. The office was orderly in the way that suggested a person who had spent a long time developing systems for managing complexity. She set the last page down and took off the glasses. She said, "The key question in a case like this is whether an administrative abandonment of federal land conveys title to on-site assets or whether those assets retain federal ownership despite the land transfer." She said it the way people who have spent 20 years in a specialty say the central question of that specialty, like a fact so fundamental it has ceased to feel like a conclusion and has become a starting point. She picked up the county transfer document. The Administrative Abandonment Protocol under the Federal Property and Administrative Services Act permits transfer of land to state or local government when the Army has determined the property has no foreseeable federal use and the cost of formal disposition exceeds the perceived value. Ray said, "And assets on the land." She said, "That's where it gets specific." She folded her hands on the desk. Standard administrative abandonment language transfers the land and improvements. An improvement under federal property law includes fixed structures, any installed infrastructure, and in most case law, anything stored on-site at the time of transfer that the federal government makes no documented effort to retain or reclaim. She tapped the county document again. The Army's position would be that the silver, if present, was a government asset stored on government property and did not transfer with the land because the Army never intended to convey it. Ray said, "In your position?" She said, "My position is that the Army had 4 years between the administrative abandonment in '89 and the county's formal acquisition of title to assert a retained interest in any on-site assets. They did not do that." She pulled out a legal pad and started writing. "They had another 31 years after county acquisition, during which you could have purchased this land at any point, to assert that interest. They did not do that either. Administrative abandonment with no documented retained interest claim followed by zero contact with the property for 3.5 decades creates a very strong argument for constructive abandonment of whatever was left behind. Can they win on the other side?" Ray said. She was quiet for a moment. She wrote 2 more lines on the legal pad. "They can make an argument. A court would have to weigh the Army's failure to document retained interest against the general principle that government property doesn't transfer without explicit statutory authority." She looked up. "But here's what matters right now. Before you do anything else with that facility, before you open the vault, before you touch the ammo cans, before you tell anyone outside this room what you found, we file a protective declaration of possession and intent to claim all on-site assets under the doctrine of constructive abandonment. We get it into the county record today. That puts anyone who wants to dispute your claim in the position of filing a legal challenge against an established documented claim rather than simply asserting federal ownership against someone who hasn't formally asserted anything yet." Ray said, "How long does that take to file?" She said, "I can have it drafted by 2 this afternoon." She picked up her pen. "I need to know one thing first. Did you remove anything from the facility?" "No." "Did your daughter?" "No." She nodded and started writing again. The protective declaration was filed at 3:47 that afternoon. Margaret sent Ray a copy by email while he was in the parking garage, and he sat in Denny's truck reading it on his phone, the legal language dense and careful, his name and the parcel number, and the words constructive abandonment and established possessory interest appearing in sequence in a document that was now part of the Latham County public record. He called Nora on the drive home. She answered immediately. She'd been in school all day, she said, and the day had felt very long. He told her about Margaret, about the filing, about the legal landscape. She was quiet through most of it, processing. When he finished, she said, "So the Army could still try to take it." "They could try," he said. "Margaret says the filing puts us in a stronger position than we'd be otherwise." "How much stronger?" He thought about how Margaret had said it. He said, "She didn't use the word guaranteed." Nora said, "Okay." He said, "She also said we should move carefully. Document everything. Get the vault open through a licensed professional so there's no question about chain of custody for whatever we find. Get an appraiser in at the same time so the initial valuation is done by someone with credentials." She said, "So we can't open it this weekend." He said, "Not responsibly." A pause. She said, "Dad, I'm going to be very honest with you. I have been thinking about that vault door since Saturday morning, and I would very much like to know what is behind it. He said, me too. She said, okay, so let's do it right and do it fast. He said he'd call Margaret in the morning about a vault technician. He said he'd have a name by the end of the week. She said, I'll be there Saturday. He said, I know. The name Margaret gave him was Roy Danner, out of Huntington, who had spent 18 years as a locksmith before specializing in antique and historical vault work. He'd done 3 military surplus properties in the past decade, Margaret said, and he understood the documentation requirements for situations where legal claims were in play. He was not cheap. His rate was $240 an hour with a 4-hour minimum, and getting a vault of this age and specification open, if it could be done without destruction, was likely going to take 6 to 8 hours. Ray did the math and felt the familiar arithmetic of not enough money pressing against the edges of something he needed to do anyway. He called Roy Danner. Danner had a voice like gravel in a coffee can, economical and certain, the voice of a man who had spent his career solving problems most people could not solve. Ray described the vault door from memory: solid steel, 2 inches thick, integrated combination lock, protective steel plate over the combination housing with security screws. Danner said, government issue. I know the model. Diebold, probably. 1950s to 1970s manufacture. He paused. The combination plate cover. That's to prevent tampering with the dial sequence during operation. The screws strip on removal, like you said. But there's a secondary access port behind the plate that was factory drilled into the door housing for exactly this kind of situation, when a facility goes dark and the combination is lost. Takes specialized tooling. I can get in without destroying the door. How long? Ray said. 6 hours, maybe 8. First time I've worked this specific door model in a live legal situation, so I'll be moving carefully. Ray said, Saturday? Danner said, I'll need the parcel documentation and your proof of ownership. Send it to my office before Friday, and we're good. Ray sent everything Thursday evening. He spent Friday buying a second flashlight and an extension cord and a portable work light, things that would make the facility usable for the work ahead, and drove up to Harker Ridge Road alone to run the work light down into the shaft on the extension cord and check the first room again. He stood in the doorway of the first room and looked at the 16 ammo cans stacked against the far wall for a long time. He counted them again out of habit. Still 16. He looked at the equipment racks and the empty crate and the locked cabinet on wheels. He looked at everything with the specific attention of a man who had learned that the most important information was often the detail you were not looking at directly. Then he went and stood in front of the vault door. The combination housing sat behind its protective steel plate, the dial invisible, the mechanism waiting. In the flashlight beam, the door had the look of something with patience built into it, the patience of steel and time and a design intended to outlast whoever put the contents inside. He put his left hand flat on the door, not pulling, not pushing, just touching it. Then he went back up the 14 rungs to the mountain air and the late afternoon sky and drove home. Saturday morning arrived with actual spring in it for the first time, warmth in the sun even at 7, birds in the tree line that hadn't been there a week ago. Roy Danner pulled up in a white cargo van at 7:45, precise to the minute, and climbed out with a rolling toolbox that he handled with the care of someone whose tools were also his reputation. He was maybe 60, thick-shouldered, with the hands of a man who worked with small tolerances and knew it. He shook Ray's hand, and then Nora's, both. Shakes, equally serious, and looked at the concrete pad and the open hatch without saying anything for a moment. He said, good hinge work. Whoever poured this pad knew what they were doing. Nora said, Army Corps of Engineers, according to the county records. 1964. Danner nodded as if that explained exactly what he needed to know about the quality of what he was about to work on. He went down first with one of his own flashlights and spent 10 minutes alone in the facility before coming back up. He said, the door's a Diebold Model 44. I've seen 2 of those in the field. Good news is the mechanism is intact. No corrosion on the dial that would affect the tumbler sequence. Bad news is the combination was almost certainly changed from factory default before the facility went dark in '88, so we're not going to find it on any standard document. He set his rolling toolbox at the edge of the hatch and started organizing what he'd need. I'll go in through the secondary access port behind the combination plate cover. That bypasses the dial mechanism entirely and engages the internal bolt work directly. How long? Nora said. He looked at her with something approaching amusement. You're counting. She said yes. He said, 5 hours if things go well. 7 if they don't. They went well. Danner worked with a silence and economy of motion that Ray recognized from people who had spent a long time being skilled at something physical and had stopped needing to explain it. He removed the steel plate cover with tools Ray had never seen before, extracted the factory-drilled access port cap, and spent the first hour and a half doing something with a tension probe and a fiber optic cable that required absolute stillness and apparently complete absence of conversation, based on the single look he gave Ray and Nora when they started talking near the shaft entrance. They went and sat on the concrete pad in the sun and waited. Nora had her legal pad. She wrote in it for a while. Not notes this time, but something else, something she turned the pad away from Ray to continue, which meant it was personal and which he respected by not asking. He sat beside her and looked at the mountain. The north faces still held snow in the creases, the same snow that had been there every Saturday he'd come up here, stubborn in the shadow lines. April was like that in the mountains. Spring came when it decided to, not when the calendar said. He thought about the last time he'd sat on the ground and waited for something to happen. Not something good, not this kind of waiting. The other kind. The kind where what came next was determined by factors outside your control, and the only thing you could do was maintain your position and trust your preparation. He'd done that kind of waiting in 2 different countries, and the waiting itself was not the hard part. The waiting taught you things. It showed you what you were actually made of when there was nothing to do but be present in the moment and honest about what you hoped for. He hoped for a great deal, sitting on the concrete pad in the April sun. He hoped for things he had not let himself hope for in 4 months of the cot, and the basefish lamp, and the $14.20 an hour. He hoped for Nora to have what she should have had. Not luxury, not opulence, nothing that would make her into someone other than who she already was. Just security. Just the absence of the arithmetic of not enough that had been the background noise of both their lives for too long. Nora stopped writing and looked at the hatch. She said, "What do you think it looks like down there right now?" He said, "Roy Danner with a fiber optic cable and a tension probe and an expression of total concentration." She laughed. "Short and real. That's not what I meant." He said, "I know what you meant." She said, "Do you think we'll know just by looking at it? Whether it's there or not?" He said, "I think we'll know." She nodded and looked back at the mountain. She said, "Dad, whatever happens with the legal stuff, whatever the Army does." She paused. "You found this place. You saw something in a photograph at midnight that everyone else had already decided was nothing, and you bid $100 on it, and now there's a vault door open down there." She looked at him. "That's real. Nobody can take that part away." He looked at his daughter, 16 years old on a concrete pad on a West Virginia mountain, telling him something he needed to hear in the specific way she had of saying things he needed to hear, which was directly and without softening and with absolute certainty. He said, "Nobody's taking anything." She said, "No, they're not." At 10:20 the sound of Danner's voice came up from the shaft. "Mr. Guthrie, you'll want to come down." Ray went down first. Nora was behind him before he'd reached the bottom rung. The vault door stood open. It had swung outward on heavy hinges, smooth despite the decades, and the darkness beyond it was the darkness of a space that had not seen light since 1988. The smell that came from it was different from the corridor smell, colder and more metallic, with something beneath it Ray could not name immediately, and then named. The smell of sealed metal containers, the specific industrial smell of things stored correctly in conditions designed to preserve them. Danner stood to the side of the open door with his flashlight and said nothing further. He had opened the door, and the rest was not his business. Ray clicked his own flashlight on and stepped through. The room was 12 feet by 16, concrete on all sides, ceiling at 6 feet. The same construction as the corridor, but tighter, more deliberately sealed. The air was dry in the way that spoke of controlled conditions maintained by the building's design even after all human maintenance had stopped. Dry and cold and still, the stillness of space that has been exactly this still for a very long time, and has no memory of being anything else. Ray stood just inside the doorway and swept the flashlight beam across the room slowly, the way he'd been taught to clear a space. Left wall first, then the far wall, then right. Standard procedure from 22 years ago, the body doing what the body had been trained to do before the brain had fully registered what it was seeing. Along the left wall, floor-to-ceiling metal shelving, welded from quarter-inch steel plate, bolted to the wall at 6 points per shelf, built to bear significant weight. And on the shelves, the weight they were bearing. Bars. Silver bars, each one wrapped in a cloth material that had gone stiff with time, but had done its job, the fabric tight around the metal beneath it, sealed at the ends with a wax-based compound. Stacked in rows on each shelf, each row precisely aligned, the edges flush in a way that said the person who stacked them had cared about the work, had expected someone to come back and see it. Nobody had come back. Until now. Ray stood and looked at them and began to count, and then stopped counting because the counting was going to take time, and counting was not what he needed to do first. What he needed to do first was simply stand there and understand that this was real, that this room existed, that he had opened this door. He had bought a condemned lot for $100 and opened a door the army had forgotten to close, and behind the door was this room. And in this room were these shelves, and on these shelves were these bars, and the bars were silver, and the silver was his. To the right, a second section of shelving, lower, 3 shelves, and on these shelves something different. Wooden cases, military specification, the kind with rope handles and hasps secured with military padlocks. 6 cases on the top shelf, 6 on the middle, 4 on the bottom. 16 cases total, which was the same number as the ammo cans in the first room, and Ray filed that connection away. At the back wall, a single steel cabinet bolted directly to the concrete, and on top of it a single object that stopped Ray completely. A folder. Cardboard military specification folder in olive drab, with a label on the front face in standard military typing, ERN7. Supplemental deposit record. Fiscal year 87 through 88. Nora was beside him. She'd been beside him since the second step into the room. She was looking at the folder the way she looked at things she intended to read very carefully. Danner's voice came from the corridor. "I'm going to start my documentation paperwork out here. You've got time." Ray said, "Thank you, Roy." He picked up the folder. He opened it. Inside was a typed inventory document. 2 pages, military format with columns for item type, quantity, unit weight, and total weight. At the top of the first page, below the site designation and the fiscal year header, a single typed line in capitals, supplemental deposit authorized under classified appropriation channel 7 Delta. Not to be entered in standard of farce records pending formal closeout of channel. He read it twice. Nora said, "What does that mean?" He handed her the page. "It means the contents of this room weren't just what Carter found in the standard of farce records." He picked up the second page. "This is a separate inventory. A supplemental deposit that came through a different funding channel in 87. Never entered in the main records because they were waiting for the channel to close out, and it never did." She read the inventory. Her finger moved down the column of quantities. She got to the bottom of the first section and stopped. She looked up at Ray. He said, "Read me the total." She said, "Silver bars. Standard military specification. 12.5 kilograms each." She paused. 84 bars. Ray was quiet. She said, "And then the supplemental. Fiscal year 87 through 88. She moved her finger down. 48 additional bars of the same specification. He did the math in his head. 132 bars. 12.5 kilograms each. 464 troy ounces per bar. 61,248 troy ounces total. Not 6,400 troy ounces. 61,000. At current prices. He did that math too. The number that came out was not $160,000. He said, "Nora." She had a calculator open on her phone. She was already doing it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she showed him the screen. $1,592,000. She said it carefully. Approximately. At current spot price. Plus the numismatic cases. He looked at her. She looked at the wooden cases on the lower shelves. 16 cases. She moved to the nearest one and examined the padlock and looked at Roy Danner's toolbox through the vault door. "Dad, can he open these too?" He said, "We're going to need the appraiser here first." She said, "I know." He said, "Call Margaret." She was already dialing. This is the moment when most people would tell you that everything changed. And it did change. But the way it changed in the hours after Nora stood in that sealed underground room on Ray Guthrie's $100 lot was not dramatic in the way you might expect. Nobody wept. Nobody shouted. Ray sat down on the cold concrete floor of the vault room and put his back against the wall and looked at the shelves for a long time without speaking, and Nora sat beside him. and for a few minutes there was no sound in the room at all except the distant ambient noise of Roy Danner writing paperwork in the corridor and the occasional sound of birds from above the open hatch. Birds that had no idea what was happening 14 feet below them on a Saturday morning in April in Latham County, West Virginia. What Ray was thinking, sitting on that floor, was not about money. Or it was about money, but not in the way you think about money when you find it. He was thinking about the conversation with Dale Pruitt on Denny's porch, about Superfund liability and clay soil and $100 wasted. He was thinking about the night he bid at midnight, about the photograph of the metal shape half buried at the edge of the concrete pad, and the thing in his chest that had said this matters, even though he could not have told you then what it mattered for. He was thinking about his right hand and the $14.20 an hour and 4 months on a cot under a base fish lamp. He was thinking about Nora on the borrowed air mattress, not complaining. She said, "Dad, you okay?" He said, "Yeah." She said, "You sure?" He said, "I'm sitting on the floor of an army vault." He paused. "I'm better than okay." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat like that while the birds called from above and the silver sat on its shelves and the morning moved on around them. Then Ray stood up, because there was work to do, and he was not someone who sat on floors when there was work to do. If you've been watching this story unfold and you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now, because what the appraiser found in those 16 wooden cases changes the number on that screen completely, and the Army's letter that arrived at Denny's house 3 days later almost ended everything before it could begin. Margaret Holt arrived at the property at 1 in the afternoon, driving a sedan that she parked at the bottom of the gravel rise and walked up from. Sensible shoes for unpaved ground. She brought a colleague named Tom Asbury who handled chain of custody documentation for contested property cases and who carried a camera and a clipboard and took photographs and notes with the thorough silence of someone doing a job that had to be done correctly or was useless. She stood in the vault room with her own flashlight and looked at the shelves for a long time. She said, "The supplemental deposit record." She held the folder in both hands, reading it with her glasses on. "The separate appropriation channel. This is actually good for us." "How so?" Ray said. She said, "The standard of farce records show a Class 3 deposit that the Army might argue was always federally retained, since it was specifically designated and inventoried. But this supplemental inventory was never entered into any federal property record. It was in this room, on your land, with no documentation in any system the Army was maintaining. That makes the constructive abandonment argument for the supplemental deposit significantly stronger." She handed the folder to Tom Asbury, who photographed each page. "There's no chain of custody from the Army's perspective for these contents. They never recorded they were here. It's going to be very difficult for them to claim retention of property they never documented putting somewhere." Ray said, "And the main inventory? The bars that were in the standard records?" She said, "That one is harder. We're going to fight it. But the Army can point to the farce designation and argue those bars were always inventoried federal property regardless of what happened to the land." She paused. "We're not going to get a clean answer on the main inventory without litigation or a negotiated settlement." Nora said, "What does that mean for the timeline?" Margaret looked at her with the particular attention she'd been giving Nora since arriving. The attention of someone recalibrating from teenager to person who asks the right questions. "It means we move fast. We get the appraiser in today. We document everything under our own chain of custody. And before the Army knows this is active, we file an expanded claim that covers both the standard and supplemental deposits under separate legal theories." She looked at Ray. "Is the appraiser coming?" Ray said, "She's on her way." Her name was Dr. Patricia Oakes, and she drove up from Bluefield in a truck with a back seat full of equipment cases. She was in her mid-40s. With the specific quality of focus that comes from spending a career handling things that other people found difficult to value accurately. She was a metals and numismatics specialist with credentials from 3 different professional associations and a client list that included 2 state historical societies and a university with a significant coin collection. She spent 40 minutes in the vault room before she spoke to anyone. When she came up, she asked for the supplemental deposit folder, which Tom Asbury produced. She read it standing, which was how she'd read everything so far, and handed it back. She said, "The bars are standard military silver, 99.9% pure, 12.5 kilo weight." She looked at the shelves. "Based on the wrapping condition and the storage environment, I'd estimate minimal oxidation. The purity will test very close to specification. Current spot price. The bars alone are in the range of 1.5 to 1.6 million, depending on the day you sell and the buyer's margin. Ray said, and the wooden cases. She said, that's a different question. She looked at him. Those cases have military specification markings indicating numismatic coin storage. She pointed to a stencil on the side of the nearest case. That's the code the Army used for pre-war coin reserves stored in hard asset redundancy programs. Same Cold War hedging that produced the silver bar deposits. But this was a separate program specifically for pre-war circulation coins that had been taken out of service and were being held as emergency hard currency. She crouched at the nearest case and examined the padlock. She looked up at Roy Danner. Can you? He said, give me 20 minutes. The case opened to reveal individual sealed sleeves, fabric over hard plastic cylinders, each one labeled in typed military format. Denomination, mint year, quantity. Roy Danner opened the case and stepped back, and Dr. Oakes moved in with gloves and her own light and lifted the first sleeve carefully. She opened it. Nora was standing close enough to see. She went very still. The coins inside were Morgan silver dollars, pre-1921, each one seated in a protective polymer sleeve that the military had used for numismatic storage. The top coin visible was dated 1904, and the condition, Dr. Oakes tilted it in the light once, was not circulated. Not even close. The devices were sharp. The luster moved when the coin moved. Dr. Oakes set it down carefully on the case lid and picked up the sleeve inventory card from the bottom of the cylinder. She read off the quantity and returned the inventory card to the sleeve with a care that said everything about what she was holding. She said, all 16 cases. Nora said, all 16? She said, the stenciling is consistent. Same program, same storage protocol. She stood and looked at the shelving. What you have in those cases, she said, are pre-war silver dollars in documented mint state condition, stored in a controlled environment for approximately 40 years with no access and no deterioration. She was quiet for a moment. The silver content of each coin is roughly 77% of a troy ounce. The spot value calculation would give you a base number. But these are not spot coins. What are they? Ray said. She said, collector coins in exceptional grades. The numismatic premium on pre-war Morgan dollars in this condition. She paused, choosing her words. At current market, a single 1904 Morgan in this grade sells at auction for between $300 and $500 per coin, depending on the specific date and mint mark. Ray heard the number and waited. She said, the sleeve inventory on that first cylinder shows 140 coins. Each case is similarly inventoried. She did the math herself, looking at nothing, just calculating. 16 cases. She said the number when she reached it. If the condition grades out where I expect them to, and I would need to formally assess each coin for that, you are looking at numismatic value in the range of $6 to $8 million. The vault room was very quiet. Nora's voice came first. She said it carefully, the way she said things she wanted to be sure she'd heard right. 6 to 8 million. Dr. Oakes said, that's a preliminary estimate pending formal grading. The actual auction results could be higher or lower. Some of these dates are more desirable than others. But the storage conditions have been exceptional. I wouldn't revise downward from 6 without seeing specific evidence of undocumented access or environmental damage, and I haven't seen either. Ray looked at the shelves, at the bars and their stiff cloth wrappings, at the 16 cases with their sealed sleeves and their typed inventory cards and their 40 years of protected storage. He thought about the minimum bid, $100. No other bidders. He thought about Dale Pruitt on the porch saying clay and rock and a hole you can't afford to investigate, and the Superfund site's certainty in his voice. He thought about Sandra saying it's not always good, and about Carter saying document everything, and about Nora finding the secondary access panel on her own, crouched at the far edge of the concrete pad in her too large Army surplus jacket, running her fingers along the seam until she found the one that mattered. He thought about his right hand, not closed all the way in the cold, holding the ring at the bottom of the sleeve and pulling, and the sound of tumblers disengaging that had been the most important sound he'd heard in 46 years of listening. He said, Patricia. She looked at him. He said, combined. The bars and the coins. Give me the number. She said, the bars, conservatively, 1.5 million. The coins, conservatively, 6 million. She paused. Combined. $7.5 million at minimum. $7.5 million on a $100 lot. In a vault the Army had forgotten to close. Nora was writing in her legal pad. Not numbers, Ray could see. She was writing in the part of the pad she turned away from him when it was personal. He didn't ask. He stood in the vault room on the last Saturday of April, disabled veteran, night security guard, $14.20 an hour, separated man with a base fish room and a cot and a right hand that didn't close all the way, and let the number exist for a moment without doing anything with it. Then he said, okay. He said it the way he said okay when he'd processed something and was ready to move forward. Not with elation. Not with shock. With the particular quiet resolution of a man who had been told things before that changed the shape of what was ahead and had learned that the only response was to take the next step. He looked at Margaret. She was already writing on her legal pad. She said, we expand the filing this afternoon. I'll have the amended claim ready by 5. She looked up. The Army is going to find out about this. Maybe through the records activity, maybe through someone talking. When they find out, they're going to move fast, and they're going to argue federal retained interest on everything they can document, which is the main bar inventory. We need to be so far ahead of them in the legal record that the argument about the bars becomes a negotiation, not a fight. Ray said, and the coins? She said, the coins are ours. The supplemental deposit record puts them outside any federal property documentation entirely. I'll stake my license on the coins. She went up the shaft to make phone calls. Tom Asbury continued photographing. Dr. Oakes began a preliminary catalog of the coin cases, working methodically from left to right, handling each sleeve with the same careful attention she'd given the first one. Roy Danner appeared at the vault room doorway, toolbox in hand. He said, good day's work. Ray looked at him. Yes, he said. It was. Danner said, you're going to need some security on this facility before I leave. He looked at the open hatch. I've got a hasp and padlock in the van that'll handle the hatch until you get something more formal set up. And I'll put a shackle on the vault door. He paused. You understand what you've got here, right? Ray said, I'm starting to understand it. Danner said, in my experience, when people find out about something like this, the first 24 hours are the most important for controlling who knows and what they think they know. He looked at Nora. You told anyone? She said no. He said, keep it that way until the lawyer's done what she's doing. He went back up to get the hasp. Ray stood in the vault room alone for a minute. Dr. Oakes was in the corridor making notes. Nora had gone up to get water from the truck. Margaret was on the phone somewhere above on the concrete pad. He looked at the bars and the cases. He thought about a thing his father had said to him when Ray was 12 years old and had found a $20 bill in the parking lot of the grocery store and had come home with it and shown it to him. Excited in the way a 12-year-old is excited about found money. His father had looked at the $20 and said, before you spend that, find out if it belongs to someone. Ray had said, I found it on the ground. Nobody dropped it right there. His father had said, that's not the question I asked. He'd thought about that conversation a lot over the years without fully understanding what his father meant by it. Standing in the vault of the Army's forgotten station, he thought he might be getting closer to understanding. The question of who this belonged to was not simple. Not the legal question, which Margaret was handling. The other question, the one about what you did with the kind of money that changed your life overnight when other people's lives had not changed. He thought about Nora on the borrowed air mattress, not complaining. He thought about what she deserved. What she'd always deserved, and what he hadn't been able to give her. Then he climbed back up the 14 rungs into the April air where his daughter was waiting with the water bottles and the legal pad and the same steady presence she'd been bringing to his life since she was born. The Army's letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after the discovery. It was addressed to Ray Guthrie, care of Denny's address, which was the address on the property transfer documentation, and it came by certified mail, which meant someone at Denny's post office signed for it. And Paulette called Ray at work to tell him about it. And he left work early for the first time since February to go home and read it. It was not a long letter. It was from the Army Corps of Engineers, Real Estate Division, and it stated in 4 paragraphs that the Army had become aware of activity on a property formerly designated as ARN-7 in Latham County, West Virginia, that the Army retained a legal interest in certain assets associated with that property under the terms of the Federal Property and Administrative Services Act, and that Mr. Guthrie was hereby notified to cease and desist from any further access to or removal of materials from The below-grade structure on said property, pending resolution of the Army's retained interest claim. Cease and desist. Ray read it twice and called Margaret. She said, "They moved faster than I expected." She did not sound alarmed. She sounded like someone who had prepared for a fight and was now being informed the fight had started. They must have flagged the property record when Carter's colleague ran the records request. "Send me the letter." He photographed it and sent it. She called back in 20 minutes. She said, "They're claiming retained interest under the FPASA, which is what I expected. They're not claiming ownership of the land, just the assets." She paused. "Here's where we are. Our expanded claim was filed Monday afternoon. We're officially on record with a complete inventory and chain of custody documentation for everything in that facility as of Saturday. Their letter references activity on the property, but doesn't acknowledge our filing, which tells me their right hand and left hand aren't talking to each other yet." She said, "The cease and desist applies to removal of materials. We haven't removed anything. We're in compliance." Ray said, "But we can't sell anything." She said, "Not yet. Nothing moves until we have legal clarity on the bars. The coins I'm comfortable will prevail on. The bars we're going to negotiate." He said, "How long?" She said, "Federal property disputes don't move fast. Could be 6 months. Could be longer. But here's what I need you to understand." She paused. "The Army's position is weakest on the supplemental deposit because they have no record of it. Their strongest argument is about the main bar inventory, but the strength of that argument is undercut by their own failure to assert retained interest for 35 years. We're going to negotiate a settlement. And in that negotiation, the fact that we have pristine documentation of everything in that facility, filed with the county before they sent this letter, matters enormously." Ray said, "What do you think the settlement looks like?" She said, "I think the Army gets a percentage of the bar value and walks away from the coins entirely." She paused. "I think in the end you keep the majority of the bars and all of the coins. I think in the end you walk away with somewhere between $5 and $7 million. Ray stood in Denny's kitchen with the certified mail letter on the table in front of him and the base fish lamp visible through the doorway and thought about that range of numbers. He said, "Margaret." She said, "Yeah." He said, "What's your fee?" She said, "Standard contingency for property disputes of this nature is 15% of the recovery." He was quiet for a moment. She said, "You're going to be fine." He said, "I know." After he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for a while. Paulette came through and looked at the certified mail letter and looked at Ray and did not ask any questions, just went and put the kettle on. Denny came home at 6 and Ray told him about the letter and about the Army's claim and about Margaret's assessment of the settlement range. Denny sat across the table and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, $5 to $7 million. Ray said, "That's what she thinks." Denny was quiet again. He picked up the certified mail letter and read it and set it down. He said, "Dale Pruitt." Ray said, "What about him?" Denny said, "He's going to hear about this. He works at the county assessor's office, Ray. When the Army files a claim with the county record, it's going to go through his office. He's going to know." Ray thought about that. Denny said, "He's going to have a lot to say." Ray said, "Dale Pruitt always has a lot to say." Dale Pruitt showed up on Wednesday. He did not knock this time. He called Denny's house at 7 in the morning, which meant he'd been waiting since at least 6:30, and when Denny answered the phone, Dale said he needed to speak to Ray, and he said it with the particular weight of a man who had been sitting on something overnight. Ray took the phone. Dale said, "I processed a federal property claim through our office yesterday afternoon. Army Corps of Engineers, Real Estate Division. Filed against your parcel on Harker Ridge Road." He paused. "What exactly did you find out there, Ray?" Ray said, "That's between me and my lawyer right now, Dale." A long pause. Dale said, "I've been in this office 11 years. I have never processed a federal retained interest claim against a parcel in this county." He said it slowly, the way people say things they have rehearsed since the previous night. "Those claims are reserved for properties with active military significance, which means whatever is on that lot is not clay and rock and a hole in the ground." Ray said, "Dale." Dale said, "What?" Ray said, "You told me I'd bought a Superfund site for $100 wasted dollars." He kept his voice level. "I appreciate that you were looking out for me. I know you were." Another pause, shorter this time. Then Dale said, more quietly, "How bad did I miss it?" Ray said, "Pretty bad." The phone was quiet for a moment. Dale said, "Well?" He cleared his throat. "I hope it works out for you, Ray. I mean that." Ray said, "I know you do, Dale. After he hung up, Denny was standing in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes, coffee in hand, having clearly been listening. He said, "That's the most Dale Pruitt has ever surprised me." Ray said, "People do sometimes." Denny said, "You were kind to him." Ray thought about it. "I've been on the receiving end of being wrong about something that mattered," he said. "It doesn't need to be made worse." He called Nora that evening. He told her about the letter. He told her about Margaret's call. He told her the specific phrase Margaret had used, 5 to 7 million. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad." He said, "Yeah." She said, "I want to come up this weekend." He said, "Okay." She said, "Not because of the money." She paused. "Well, because of the money partly, but also because I want to sit on that concrete pad again, with the hatch open. I want to do that while I still remember what it felt like before it was complicated." Ray understood that exactly. He said, "Come up Friday evening." She said, "I'll bring the book." He said, "Chapter 7? She said, "Chapter 7. He said, "Nora." She said, "Yeah." He said, "You found that panel. You found the secondary access. You're the reason any of this is happening." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You bought the lot." He said, "For $100. She said, "For $100. She paused. "We're a good team." He said, "The best." After they hung up, he sat in the kitchen until Paulette called him in for dinner. And he ate at the table with Denny and Paulette and answered their questions about the Army's letter and Margaret's strategy and the timeline, and felt something he had not expected to feel in the middle of a federal property dispute and a cease and desist letter and a legal fight that was going to take months. He felt grateful. Not for the money. Not yet. Not with the fight still ahead and nothing resolved. For the lot on Harker Ridge Road. For the photograph of the metal shape at the edge of the concrete pad that had made something in him say, "This matters," at 11:43 on a Tuesday night in March, when he was eating leftover chili in his brother's kitchen on a folding chair. For his daughter, who had found the panel. For his father, who had said, "Find out if it belongs to someone," which was not a question about the $20 bill at all, but about the kind of man you wanted to be when you found something that changed your situation. He was going to find out what kind of man that was. He thought he already knew. Outside on the mountain, in the sealed dark of the vault room below the concrete pad, the silver sat on its shelves in the stiff cloth wrappings where it had been sitting since 1988, patient in the way things are patient when they have no choice but to wait. And the coins sat in their cases in their polymer sleeves where nobody had touched them in 40 years. And the tumblers in the Diebold vault door sat in their disengaged positions where Roy Danner had left them, and the hatch above the shaft sat closed and padlocked with the hasp Roy had installed on Saturday afternoon. Everything that had happened was documented. Everything that would happen was still ahead. Ray Guthrie went to bed in the base fish room, on the cot, under the lamp, and for the first time in 4 months he slept before midnight. The legal fight lasted 3 months, which Margaret said was fast, which meant that by the standards of disputes involving federal property law and the Army's bureaucratic apparatus, 3 months constituted something approaching a sprint. The Army's initial position, as delivered through a JAG officer named Captain Ellie Morse in a meeting at Margaret's Charleston office in early May, was that the assets in the below-grade structure on Lot 17 were federally retained property under the FPASA, and that no administrative abandonment of land could convey title to assets placed on government property for specifically governmental purposes, regardless of how long those assets had been sitting there. Margaret's response was measured and prepared and documented in writing before the meeting ended. The Army had 35 years to assert that retained interest. They had not done so. The supplemental deposit existed in no federal property record of any kind and therefore could not be claimed under any federal property statute because the federal government had never acknowledged its existence. The standard bar inventory, while documented in a farce records, was subject to the same constructive abandonment argument as the land itself. Captain Morse was professional and careful and gave nothing away. She said she would communicate the position to the real estate division. She left. Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Ray. She said, "She's a good lawyer. She's not going to win." Ray said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because her strongest argument is about the documented bars, and that argument has a fundamental problem." She sat down with her coffee. "The Army's position requires us to accept that they retained ownership of assets while simultaneously making no effort to retrieve or protect those assets for 35 years. They didn't even put a lien on the property. They let it go to county auction. She tapped the folder on her desk. You can't claim you retained ownership of something you made zero effort to retain. 3 weeks passed. Then a letter arrived from the real estate division proposing a 30% allocation of the documented bar value to the Army in exchange for a full release of all retained interest claims, including a stipulation that the supplemental deposit inventory, referred to in the letter only as additional materials not subject to federal documentation, was outside the scope of the Army's claim entirely. Margaret read the letter twice. Then she called Ray. She said, "They're releasing the coins. They're releasing the supplemental bars. They're asking for 30% of the main bar inventory." Ray said, "How much is that?" She did the math aloud. At current spot price, 30% of the main bar inventory value is approximately $480,000. Ray said, "And we keep the rest." She said, "Everything else. All 132 bars. You pay 30% of the main inventory value to the Army, and they walk away. The coins stay entirely with you." She paused. "I'd counter at 20% and expect to settle at 25%. She settled at 23% in the second week of June. Ray paid the Army $411,000 from the proceeds of the first coin sale Dr. Oakes arranged, $100 Morgan from a single sleeve that cleared $280,000 at auction in Cincinnati. He paid Margaret's 15% on the full recovery. He paid the county every fee and penalty associated with the original condemned property. He paid for vault resecuring and Roy Danner's documentation work and a structural engineer who certified the below-grade facility as sound. After everything was paid, Ray Guthrie sat in Margaret's office on the third Thursday of July with a wire transfer confirmation on the desk between them and looked at the number that represented what was left. $4,937,000. He looked at it for a long time. Margaret said, "That's a preliminary number. Dr. Oakes is estimating the full coin auction, handled across multiple sales to preserve the market value, will bring between 6 and 8 million total. When the remaining coins sell over the next 18 to 24 months, you'll be looking at a final number in the 7 to 9 million range." Ray said, "After your fee." She said, "After my fee." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the confirmation. He looked at Margaret. He said, "You did good work." She said, "You bought the right lot." He said, "For $100. She smiled. "For $100. The news spread through Latham County the way news spreads in places where everyone knows everyone and nobody has much reason to hold information privately. The county property records were public documents, and the Army's claim and subsequent settlement were both filed there, and Dale Pruitt worked in the office where those records were processed, and Dale Pruitt had a wide social network maintained through 30 years of county employment and a temperament inclined toward conversation. The version of the story that circulated was mostly accurate. A disabled veteran had bought a condemned lot at auction for $100. His teenage daughter had found a hidden hatch. Inside was an Army vault containing millions in silver bars and rare coins. The Army had tried to take it. The veteran's lawyer had fought them off. The veteran had won. The specific numbers shifted in the retelling the way numbers do, drifting upward with each iteration, the vault growing in size, the timeline compressing. By the time the story reached the county paper, which ran a piece in August under a headline Ray had not contributed to and could not control, the discovery had become the kind of thing people in Latham County would reference for years. The $100 lot on Harker Ridge. Ray Guthrie's vault. People said it the way they said things that had entered the local register of notable events, with a particular combination of pride and enjoyment, the pride of a community claiming something remarkable that happened within its borders. Dale Pruitt appeared at Denny's house on the afternoon the county paper ran the story, which was a Thursday. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets and an expression that had required a significant amount of effort to produce, effort of the kind you make when you've been wrong in a public and specific way and you've decided the right response is to say so directly. He said, "I owe you an apology bigger than the one I already gave you on the phone." Ray said, "You don't owe me anything, Dale." Dale said, "I told you that property was worthless. I told you it was a $100 mistake. I said it with a lot of confidence for a man who turned out to be completely wrong." Ray said, "You were working with the information you had." Dale said, "I was working with assumptions I called information." He paused. "There's a difference, and I should have known better, working where I work." He looked at the ground for a moment. "I'm glad it worked out for you. Genuinely. I know things have been hard. Ray looked at the man who had stood on his brother's porch and talked about Superfund sites and clay soil and $100 wasted, and had said all of it with the certainty of someone who believed difficulty was the same as impossibility. He thought about how easy it would be to say something that pointed at the distance between Dale's certainty and the reality. How easy and how small. He said, "Come in and have coffee, Dale." Dale looked surprised. Then he nodded and followed Ray inside, and they sat at Denny's kitchen table and drank coffee and talked for an hour about the facility and the vault and Margaret's legal strategy and what Roy Danner had done with the fiber optic cable. And Dale asked questions with genuine curiosity and listened to the answers with genuine attention. And by the time he left, something had shifted between them in the small but real way that honest conversation shifts things between people who have previously dealt in assumptions. At the door, Dale said, "I shouldn't have been so sure of myself." Ray said, "None of us should be. But we usually are." Dale nodded and went down the porch steps and drove away. And Ray stood in the doorway watching him go and thought about the fact that certainty is a comfortable place to live until the ground shifts under it. The county paper story brought other conversations Ray hadn't anticipated. Frank Devlin, who owned the hardware store in town and had sold Ray the extension cord and the portable work light back in March, stopped him in the parking lot one Friday and said he'd heard what happened. He didn't ask about money. He said, "My grandfather bought a piece of property after the war that everyone told him was worthless. Mountain land. Trees on it nobody could farm. He held it for 30 years and logged it when timber prices went up, and that money put my father through college." He put his hand on Ray's arm briefly. "Some people see things other people don't see yet." He walked away. Ray thought about Frank Devlin's grandfather for days afterward. Sandra called on a Friday evening in July. Her voice was different from the voice she usually used on the phone, which was practical and direct and assumed the shortest path between 2 points. This voice was slower, taking its time with the words. She said, "Nora told me about the settlement." Ray said, "I was going to call you." She said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" He said, "I'm good. I'm actually good." She said, "I'm glad." She paused again. "I mean that, Ray. I know things have been hard for a long time, and I know a lot of that was things I made harder, and I'm glad you found this." He said, "We found it. Nora found it." She said, "She told me you saw it first." "In the photograph." He said, "She found the panel. That was the whole thing." Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She's been different since she started spending time up there. Lighter. Like something she was carrying got set down somewhere." He said, "It was good for me too." She said, "I know." She took a breath. "I'm not calling about money. I want you to know that. Nora will have what she needs. I trust you with that." He said, "She will." Sandra said, "What are you going to do with it?" He said, "I don't know all of it yet. I know some of it. I'm going to get my hand looked at by someone who actually knows what they're doing. I'm going to buy land up by Harker Ridge and build something on it. Nothing big, just a place that's mine. I'm going to make sure Nora doesn't have to worry about school." He paused. "After that, I'll figure the rest out as I go." Sandra said, "That sounds like you." He said, "Yeah." She said, "Ray?" He said, "Yeah." She said, "I'm sorry I left the way I left. The timing. I know it was bad timing." He said, "You were doing what you needed to do." She said, "I was. But the way I did it wasn't good." She paused. "I've thought about it a lot. The kids saw me do that, and they're going to carry that. I wish I'd done it differently." He said, "We both did things we do differently." She said, "I guess so." She paused. "I want you to know something, though." She took a moment to find the words. "When things were good between us, the early years, I always thought you saw things other people missed. You'd look at something ordinary and find what was interesting about it. I thought that was one of the best things about you." She paused. "I forgot about that for a while." She said, "The lot reminded me." He said, "Sandra." She said, "I'm not trying to make this into something it isn't. I just wanted you to know I remembered." He said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "You should know. The kids are proud of you. Both of them. Not because of the money. Because of the lot and the hatch and the whole story. They tell it to people." He said, "They do?" She said, "Jake told his whole baseball team." She laughed, which was the laugh he remembered from when things between them had been good, short, and genuine. Nothing performed about it. He apparently made it sound like you were Indiana Jones. Ray said, "I was on a cot in Denny's storage room eating peanut butter." She said, "That's not the version Jake tells." After they hung up, Ray sat in the kitchen for a long time. Not sad. Not elated. Something more settled than either of those things. Something that felt like the end of a chapter rather than the end of a story, which was different and meant more. He called Carter Webb on a Saturday morning in August. Carter answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the background sounds of a city, a fan running, traffic below a window somewhere in Arlington. Ray said, "I want to say thank you." He said it simply, the way his father had taught him to say things that mattered, without qualification or decoration. "You ran that record search, and you sent me the documentation, and you told me to document everything. None of this happens without that." Carter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I gave you the information. You did the rest." Ray said, "I want to do something. Not a gift. A donation. You told me about the Fayetteville house once. The transition program for post-combat veterans. You mentioned it a few years ago, and I couldn't do anything about it then." He paused. "I can now." Carter said, "Ray?" Ray said, "That program's been waiting on funding, you told me. 300,000 would change what they can do for the next 5 years." Carter was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Yes, it would." Ray said, "Then let's do 300,000. Carter said, "You don't have to do that." Ray said, "I know." He paused. "I bought this lot because something in me said it mattered. I don't want to spend the next 20 years wondering if that was just luck or if it was supposed to lead somewhere." He said, "Help me make it lead somewhere." Carter said, "Okay." He said it with the quiet certainty of a man who had heard a lot of things over many years and knew the real ones when he heard them. "Okay, Ray." The steel cabinet at the back of the vault room was the last thing they cataloged. Dr. Oakes had been through the bars and the coin cases by the time they got to it. And it was Nora who finally asked Roy Danner to deal with the lock on a Saturday in late May when they'd come back to the property to continue the documentation process. The cabinet was bolted to the concrete, the lock a simple keyed mechanism corroded in place, and Danner had it open in 15 minutes. Inside were 2 items. The first was a 3-ring binder, vinyl cover, olive drab, with a typed label on the spine, ARN7. Station log, 1964 to 1988. Inside were handwritten entries, not military technical entries, but something closer to journal entries, the kind of record kept by whoever was posted to a facility to mark the days in some human way. Different handwriting across the decades, different voices. Some entries were purely functional. Quarterly inspection complete, equipment nominal, no issues to report. Others were personal in the way people get personal when they're alone in a concrete room for weeks at a time and there's nobody to talk to but a logbook. An entry from February of 1971, in careful printing that suggested a man who'd been taught penmanship by someone who cared about it. 7 degrees outside. Heater running fine. Read the whole of Lord Jim this week. Porter brought it on the last rotation. Good book for a man stuck underground. You think about what it is to lose your nerve and whether a man can get it back. An entry from August of 1978, different handwriting, smaller and faster. 3 months down here this rotation. Mail came late again. Photos of the kids are up on the wall. Tommy lost his first tooth. I was not there for it. An entry from June of 1988, the last entry in the log, which was also the month of the last recorded inspection on the facility log upstairs. Final rotation complete. Waiting on transfer orders and formal closeout from command. Somebody will be down here to finish this up. They'll find this log and know that people were here, that we took care of this place, and we did our jobs, and we went home when they told us to go home. Whoever you are reading this, we were here. That should count for something. The second item in the cabinet was a manila envelope, sealed with tape that had dried and cracked but held. Inside the envelope were 4 photographs. Small, square, the kind taken with a pocket camera in the 1970s. They showed the facility before it had been sealed, the corridor with overhead lights functioning and illuminating the space, the vault room with the shelves full and the door open, and 2 men in army fatigues standing in the corridor grinning at the camera with the look of men who have just finished a job and know it was done well. On the back of one of the photographs, in pencil, now faint but legible, ARN7 complete. April 1964. Sergeant Harlan Briggs and Spec. Don Keeler, 1st Corps of Engineers. We built it right. It'll last. Nora read the words on the back of the photograph and held it for a long time. She said, "They built it right." Ray said they did. She said, "And it lasted." He said, 60 years. She looked at the photograph of the 2 men grinning in the corridor. She said, Do you think anyone ever told their families where they were when this was taken? He said, probably not. Classified posting. She said, so nobody knew. Their kids didn't know. They just went somewhere and came back, and the place they'd been was a secret. He said, that was the job. She held the photograph carefully, the way she'd held the coin Dr. Oakes had shown her in the vault room, with the specific care of someone who understood they were holding something that had been waiting to be held again for a very long time. She said, we should find out if they're still alive. Harlan Briggs and Don Keeler. Ray said, that might be difficult. She said, 1964, they were what, 25? They'd be in their mid-80s now. She looked at the photograph again. I want them to know someone came back. That someone found this place and knows they built it right. Ray looked at his daughter. He said, okay. She said, I'm serious. He said, I know you are. We'll try to find them. She nodded and put the photograph back in the envelope with the same care she'd taken it out with. She placed the envelope on top of the station log and looked at both of them for a moment. She said, this goes in the station. It stays here. He said, you sure? We could display it somewhere. Document it properly. She said, it belongs here. She looked at the vault room walls, the concrete that Harlan Briggs and Don Keeler had poured in April of 1964 and that had held for 60 years exactly as they'd built it to hold. This is where they left it. She paused. We take the silver. We leave the record of the people. Ray stood in the vault room for a moment and felt the weight of that distinction. What you take and what you leave. What has monetary value and what has a different kind of value that money can't denominate. He said, okay. He put the envelope back in the cabinet and closed the door. He moved out of the base fish room on the second Saturday of August. There was not much to move. 3 cardboard boxes, the folding cot, the lamp shaped like a bass fish that Denny had given him when he left because he said it suited Ray better than it suited the storage room. Denny stood in the driveway while Ray loaded the truck and did not offer help because Ray didn't need it, and they both understood that. When the truck was loaded, Denny stood with his hands in his pockets in the way he stood when he had something to say and was arranging how to say it. He said, you can always come back if you need to. Ray said, I know. Denny said, I mean it. The room's there. Ray said, Denny. Denny said, what? Ray said, I'm buying you a new truck. Denny stared at him. Ray said, not this week. When the next coin auction settles in October. The truck I've been borrowing for 7 months. He paused. I'm buying you a new one. Whatever you want. Denny looked at his own truck, the one that had driven up Harker Ridge Road more times than either of them had counted, the one with the grinding transmission sound that had been the reason Ray was on the county website at midnight when the listing appeared. Denny said, that truck runs fine. Ray said, it has a grinding transmission sound. Denny said, I know what sound it has. He was quiet for a moment. You don't have to buy me a truck, Ray. Ray said, I know I don't have to. Denny said nothing. Ray said, you gave me a room. He kept his voice level. You and Paulette gave me a room and a kitchen and meals I didn't ask for, and you didn't say anything about when I was going to leave or when things were going to get better. That's worth more than a truck. But a truck is what I can do. Denny looked at the ground. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, which surprised Ray, because Denny was not a man whose eyes went wet easily. He said, okay. Yeah, thank you. Ray shook his brother's hand and got in the truck and drove away from the base fish room and did not look back. The property on Harker Ridge Road was now, officially and completely, his. In September, he contracted a builder from Beckley named Francis Kimball, who specialized in small homes on difficult terrain, and he described what he wanted. Not large. 3 rooms and a bathroom and a porch facing east toward the mountain. Built into the flat near where the concrete block building had stood before the county knocked it down in July. The concrete pad would remain, the hatch secured with a proper steel cover, the below-grade facility stabilized and documented and closed but not destroyed. History didn't require demolition. It required acknowledgement. Francis Kimball walked the property twice and asked questions with the thoroughness of someone who understood that what you build on difficult ground has to understand the ground first. She said she could have a foundation poured before first frost. She said the house itself would be done by spring. Ray said, make the porch wide enough to sit on. She said, how wide? He said, wide enough for 2 people who have things to talk about. She made the porch 12 feet wide. Nora came up in September for what was now becoming a regular pattern, a weekend every month in addition to the 2-week summer stay, driving up herself because she'd gotten her license in July and Sandra had let her take the Civic. She walked the property with Ray and stood where the foundation stakes marked the corners of what was going to be built, and she looked at the concrete pad and the new steel cover over the hatch and the mountain beyond. She said, "This is going to be a real place." Ray said, "It's already a real place." She said, "You know what I mean. Your place." He said, "Yeah, my place." She put her hand on the foundation stake nearest her and looked at the outline of the floor plan staked out in the September grass. She was trying to see what it would look like from inside. He could tell, the way she tried to see things from inside them before they were finished. She said, "Can I have a room here?" He said, "You can have the room that faces the mountain." She said, "I might not use it much. Once I go to college." He said, "It'll be there." She looked at the staked corners for another moment. Then she said, "I got my college applications ready." She said it the way she said things she'd been building up to, careful and direct. "I'm applying to the history program at William and Mary, and Penn, and Ohio State, and Pitt as a safety." He said, "Any of those will take you." She said, "Maybe." He said, "Nora, any of those will take you." She said, "I'm also applying for the Early Merit Scholarship at William and Mary, the one for West Virginia residents." She paused. "I probably won't get it. The competition is heavy." He said, "Apply for it." She said, "Dad, you have the money now. I don't need a scholarship." He looked at his daughter. He said, "Apply for it because you've earned it, not because you need it. There's a difference." She thought about that. Then she nodded. He said, "And Nora?" She said, "Yeah." He said, "Wherever you go, whatever program, whatever it costs." He said it simply, the way his father had taught him to say things that mattered. "I've got it." She looked at the mountain for a moment. Then she said, "We got it, Dad. Both of us." He said, "Yeah, we did." The William and Mary acceptance arrived in December, and the scholarship letter came 2 weeks after that. Nora called him from her mother's house at 7 in the evening, her voice carrying the specific quality of someone trying to sound calm about something that was not calm at all. She said, "I got the merit scholarship, Dad." He said, "I know you did." She said, "I just said I probably wouldn't get it." He said, "I know what you said." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It covers 60% of tuition." He said, "Then we cover the other 40. She said, "Dad." He said, "What?" She said, "I want to study Cold War history." She said it like she'd been thinking about how to say it for a while. "The domestic infrastructure programs. The sites they built." She paused. "The ones people forgot about." Ray sat with that for a moment. He said, "That sounds right." She said, "It feels right." He said, "Nora." She said, "Yeah." He said, "You found the panel." He let the silence hold for a second. "I just want you to know I remember that. Every time. You found the panel." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You pulled the ring." He said, "Yeah." She said, "We're a good team." He said, "The best there is." In October, he drove to a neurological rehabilitation clinic in Pittsburgh, the one Carter had recommended, the one that specialized in peripheral nerve injuries. He'd made the appointment in September, which was the first time he'd made a medical appointment for his hand that wasn't at the VA clinic in Beckley where they gave him exercises he already knew and sent him home. The specialist's name was Dr. Voss, and she examined his hand for 45 minutes with the thoroughness of someone who found hands interesting as mechanical systems and believed that interesting mechanical systems deserved serious attention. She reviewed the Walter Reed records and the subsequent years of treatment and the current grip strength measurements and the cold morning pattern of the fingers curling without permission. She said, "The nerve damage from 2004 is what it is. We can't reverse it. But the pattern you're describing, the cold morning contraction, that's a secondary compensation issue. The muscles around the damaged nerves have developed a habitual tension pattern in response to the original injury." She said, "Physical therapy targeting that specific pattern combined with some options I'd like to discuss on the pharmacological side." She looked at him. "I think we can get you to 30 pounds of grip strength on a cold morning. Maybe more with time." Ray said, 30 pounds. She said, "That's not a guarantee. That's an estimate based on what I'm seeing." He said, "I've been testing at 12. She said, "I know." She looked at the chart. "I'd like to get you into a program here. 8 weeks to start. Intensive work, 3 days a week." She paused. "This isn't going to be comfortable." He said, "I've been uncomfortable before." She looked at him. She said, "I believe that." He drove back from Pittsburgh on the turnpike in the October dark with the mountains around him and the truck's headlights cutting through the fog in the low valleys, and thought about 30 pounds of grip strength on a cold morning. He thought about what his hand had been able to do before Fallujah and what he'd stopped asking of it since, and what it might still be able to do if he stopped accepting 12 as the final answer. He thought about how many things he had accepted as final answers in the years since 2004. Not just the hand. The cot in the basefish room had felt like a final answer in March, before it wasn't. The night security job at $14.20 an hour had felt like the ceiling of what was available to a man with a partial grip and a disrupted nerve. Dale Pruitt on the porch had offered up Ray's own situation as a final answer, delivered with the confidence of someone who lived in a county assessor's office and confused familiarity with certainty. None of those had been final answers. They'd been present conditions he'd mistaken for permanent ones. He thought about the hatch, about what it had sounded like when the tumblers disengaged and the mechanism did exactly what it was designed to do after 35 years of nobody asking it to do anything. That was what a thing built right sounded like when you finally gave it the chance to work. He thought about $100 and a midnight bid and a hatch in the ground that everyone else had already decided was nothing. He thought about the kind of man you wanted to be when you found something that changed your situation. He thought his father would have had something to say about all of it. Something patient and precise, delivered from the porch chair after a pause long enough that you knew it had been fully considered. He found Harlan Briggs in November. The man who had built ARN-7 with Don Keeler in April of 1964 was 87 years old and living in a retirement community outside Roanoke, Virginia. He was in good health for his age, his daughter told Ray on the phone when Ray called the number he'd found through a veterans service organization after 6 weeks of trying. His mind is sharp, she said. He talks about his Army years a lot. He built things, she said. Structures, facilities, all over the country during the Cold War. He was proud of it. Ray said, "Is he well enough to talk?" She said, "Let me ask him." Harlan Briggs came on the phone 2 minutes later. His voice was slower than a younger man's, but the words were precise, the words of someone who had spent a lifetime being specific about measurements and tolerances. He said, "ARN-7. Harker Ridge Road. Latham County, West Virginia." He said it like a set of coordinates he'd carried for 60 years without being asked to, but had always been ready to produce. "I poured that concrete myself. I told Keeler we were doing it 4 inches thicker than spec because the ridge gets ground movement in hard winters, and I didn't want to come back in 5 years and find it cracked." He paused. "How's it holding?" Ray said, "Perfect. Not a crack anywhere." A pause on the line. Then Harlan Briggs made a sound that Ray recognized as the sound a man makes when he's been told that something he built 60 years ago is still standing exactly as he intended it to stand. Relief and satisfaction mixed together, quieter than pride, because it was more personal than pride. He said, "Don Keeler passed in 2016. Heart." Ray said, "I'm sorry." He said, "He was a good man and a good soldier, and he would have been glad to hear this." He paused. "What did you find in there?" "The property changed hands, so something got opened up." Ray told him. "Not all of it, not the legal details, but the vault and the silver and the coins and the station log." He described the photographs in the manila envelope. The 2 men grinning in the corridor in 1964. Harlan Briggs was quiet for a moment. He said, "We built that to last." Ray said, "You did." He said, "And you found it." Ray said, "My daughter found it. She found the secondary access panel. She knew what she was looking at." Harlan said, "How old is your daughter?" Ray said, 16. Harlan made the same sound again, the relief and satisfaction sound. He said, 16. He said it with the particular weight a man gives a number when it means something specific to him. He said, "Don's granddaughter is 16. Same age." He paused. "You should bring your daughter to meet her sometime. 2 girls who understand that what you build matters. That it stays." Ray said, "I think I'd like that." They talked for another 20 minutes. Harlan asked specific questions about the condition of the below-grade structure, the concrete thickness in the walls, the integrity of the shelving, the drainage in the corridor. He asked these questions the way an engineer asks them, wanting precise answers because imprecision was a habit he'd never developed. Ray answered as accurately as he could, and Harlan nodded at each answer, the nodding audible in the rhythm of his responses. At the end of the call, Harlan said, "One more thing." Ray said, "Yeah." He said, "The hatch cover. The one you replaced with the steel cover." He paused. "When I poured that pad, I put a date stamp in the concrete near the hatch frame. Small, on the east side. Pressed in with a steel stamp before the concrete set. April 14th, 1964. He paused. Don pressed it in himself. He made me wait until he found a stamp the right size, because he said if you're going to mark something you built, you mark it properly. He was quiet for a moment. I'd like to know if it's still there. Ray said, I'll go look. He drove up to Harker Ridge Road that same afternoon and crouched at the east edge of the new hatch cover and pushed the cover aside slightly and shone his flashlight into the gap, and there it was in the concrete, pressed in clearly, faded slightly by 60 years, but completely legible. April 14th, 1964. He called Harlan back and told him. Harlan Briggs was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Good. He said it simply, the way you say a word when it contains more than words can carry. Good. He stood on Harker Ridge Road on the last Saturday of November, the frame of the house up now and the walls going in, Francis Kimball's crew having pushed hard through October to get the structure closed before the weather turned. Snow on the north faces of the mountains in the same creases where it had been in March when he'd first driven up this road, the road that had crested into the flat where the concrete block building stood and where everything that followed had begun. The concrete pad was clear in the November light. The steel cover on the hatch sat flush the way a cover should sit when it's been properly fitted by someone who cares about the work. The below-grade facility was stabilized and secured and documented and known, which was different from what it had been in March when it was none of those things. Nora was not here today. She was at school, which was where she should be, and Ray had driven up alone because he wanted to stand here alone for a moment and understand something. He stood on the pad and put his right hand on the steel cover. The cold was in the air, but his hand was open, fingers extended, not curling. He'd been in the Pittsburgh program for 3 weeks, and his grip strength had tested at 19 pounds on Monday morning, which was not 30, but was not 12 either, and Dr. Voss had said what she always said, which was this is a process and not a conclusion, which was advice that applied to a lot of things beyond hands. He stood on the pad and looked at the mountain and at the frame of the house going up in the flat where the old building had been, and he thought about the listing that had loaded at 11:43 on a Tuesday night in March when he was eating leftover chili and had accidentally clicked on the wrong website and found a condemned lot in the middle of nowhere that nobody wanted. He thought about the basefish lamp and the cot, about 4 months of peanut butter and $14.20 an hour and the $150 in the separate account. He thought about Nora finding the panel, about the sound of the tumblers when he pulled the ring, about the vault door swinging open on smooth hinges and the smell of sealed space and the silver bars on their shelves and the stiff cloth wrappings exactly where someone had placed them 35 years ago. He thought about Harlan Briggs on the phone saying we built that to last with the specific satisfaction of a man whose work had outlasted the reasons. It was built for and endured into something new and unexpected, which was maybe the best thing a man could say about anything he'd done with his hands and his years. He thought about the date stamp in the concrete. April 14th, 1964. Don Keeler pressing the steel stamp in while the concrete was still setting, because if you're going to mark something you built, you mark it properly. He thought about the station log entry from June of 1988. Whoever you are reading this, we were here. That should count for something. It counted. Ray knew it counted because he'd read it and he'd been moved by it, and he'd told Nora to leave the record in the cabinet where those men had left it, which was a decision he'd stand behind for the rest of his life. You take the silver and you leave the record of the people. That distinction meant something. It was the kind of distinction that separated what you did with good fortune from who you were before you had it. We built it right. It'll last. He thought about his father in the porch chair. Patient and certain. You knew what you were looking at. You just had to be willing to look. He thought about $100. He stayed on the concrete pad until the lights started going behind the mountain in the way it goes in late November, the day ending at 4 o'clock the way West Virginia days end in November, abruptly and completely, winter not asking permission. Then he got in the truck and drove down the road. He had a house to finish building. He had a daughter who was going to college in the fall. He had a right hand that was at 19 pounds and going higher. He had a phone call to make to Harlan Briggs about 2 16-year-old girls who should probably meet each other. He had a fund to finalize in Fayetteville. He had more than he'd had. That was the simple fact of it, stated without ceremony because ceremony was not what it needed. He had $100 lot and a vault and a hatch the Army forgot to close and a daughter who found the panel. And out of all of that he had this. A life that had been broken in several important places, and that was, with time and work and the willingness to bid at midnight on a thing that looked like nothing, being put back together. Not fixed, not erased. Put back together, which is different, which keeps the evidence of what happened and uses it as part of the structure going forward. The house was finished in late March, 1 year almost to the week from the night Ray had found the listing. Frances Kimball walked it with him on the day of the final inspection, pointing out the things she was proud of and the things she'd want him to know about for maintenance. The way a builder who cared about the work explained a finished house to the person who was going to live in it. The porch faced east exactly as he'd asked. 12 feet wide. 2 chairs already on it, which Frances had left as a finishing touch. The chairs made of wood with a natural finish, the kind built to weather. He spent his first night there alone. He'd brought the base fish lamp from Denny's because it felt right, the lamp that had been above the cot in the storage room for 4 months, and that had witnessed every night he'd lain awake doing the arithmetic of not enough and trying to understand what came next. He put it on the table by the window of the room that faced the mountain, which was his room, not Nora's, and turned it on and sat in the chair by the window and looked at the mountain in the dark. In the morning, he made coffee on the stove he'd chosen himself and took it out to the porch and sat in one of the chairs Frances had left and watched the sun come over the mountain in the way it came over at the end of March, the light finding the ridge first and then spreading down the slope in a slow disclosure. The concrete pad was visible from the porch. The steel cover on the hatch caught the morning light and threw it back. He held the coffee cup in his right hand. His grip strength had been testing at 24 pounds on good mornings now, still not 30, but moving. He held the cup and felt the weight of it in his palm and watched the sun come over the mountain on the first morning in a home that was his. Some people say the money changed everything. Ray would tell you the money was the last part of it. The first part was the photograph. The second part was Nora's hand on the secondary access panel in the frost-stiff weeds on a March morning, finding what was there to be found because she'd done the research and she'd walked the perimeter and she'd crouched at the far edge where the tree line began and felt the air coming through the seam. The third part was pulling a ring at the bottom of a concrete sleeve and hearing a sound like certainty. Everything after that was consequence. The consequence happened to be $4,937,000 with more coming as the coin sales completed. Ray was not going to pretend that was nothing. It was not nothing. It was the difference between the base fish room and the porch facing the mountain. It was the difference between 12 pounds of grip strength accepted as permanent and 19 pounds on the way to 30. It was the difference between Nora worrying about the cost of school and Nora applying for the merit scholarship at William and Mary because she'd earned it, not because she needed it. That's not nothing. That's everything that money can actually be, which is the removal of the arithmetic of not enough from the background of every decision. It doesn't change who you are. It changes what you can do. Ray understood the difference clearly because he'd spent enough years without the second thing to know exactly what it was worth. He drove down Harker Ridge Road in the November dark with the mountain behind him and the house frame going up in the flat and the vault sealed below the concrete pad and 60 years of other people's work, holding everything in place. And he thought about what it meant that a man like him, with a hand that didn't close all the way and a cot in a storage room and $150 in a separate account, had been the one to find this. He didn't have a complete answer for that. He had the beginning of one, which was this: some things wait for the person who's willing to see them, not the person who has the most to spend or the best connections or the cleanest circumstances. The person who looks at a photograph at midnight and feels something and bids anyway. That was the whole of it. He pulled onto the paved road at the bottom of Harker Ridge and headed toward Denny's house, which was where he was still staying while the house went up. And he thought about the porch that was going to be 12 feet wide and the room that faced the mountain that was going to be Nora's when she came back from wherever school took her, and the open space on the property where the concrete block building had stood that he'd decided to leave empty, just grass, because some things didn't need to be replaced. They just needed to have been. If this story meant something to you, subscribe now and share it with someone who needs to hear that the thing everyone else passed on might be exactly the thing worth stopping for. Ray Guthrie bought a condemned lot for $100. His daughter found the door. The army forgot to close it. And what was waiting inside changed both their lives. Part 3 is done. Ray Guthrie is home. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.